Especially for new developers, I definitely recommend using Shadcn UI. It's a component library where all of the source code for all of these common and useful components here are available to you in your source code. And so you'll be able to go in and customize these and change them as you find necessary. As you can see, we can use them for a multitude of different types of applications: dashboards, tasks, playgrounds, forms, music, authentication, etc. To get started, we can go over into installation here. You can also get there by going to the docs up here in the nav bar and then going to installation. In order to use Shadcn, we need to install it. Under frameworks, in this project, we're going to be using Next.js, so we're going to select that one. I'm also going to be using Node Package Manager, NPM. It's pretty much the standard one that most people use and is the most common. So that's the one I'm going to be using for this tutorial. You're welcome to use whichever package manager that you'd like for your own project. In order to follow the directions here and run the command, you can either select over it like this and hit Control-C to copy it, or you can hit the little clipboard icon here to the right, which will copy it. We can then go into the terminal of choice and then paste our command in. Make sure that you're doing it in a valid Next.js project. If you do, it'll see here, say found Next.js. Also ensure that to use Shadcn, you also need to use Tailwind CSS. It's going to ask you what base color you'd like to use if you're interested. Slate, gray, zinc, neutral, and stone. Those are the options that they provide. And I would say that slate and gray are more bluish in their darker colors. All the whites are obviously white. And neutral and stone, I would say, have this kind of grayish brown color, and zinc is right in the middle. I'm a bit curious as to why zinc isn't the neutral one, but I'm just going to use the default neutral color. I feel like zinc should be neutral just because it's kind of the middle ground in between all of these, but who am I to judge? We have here a quirk with using Shadcn with the latest React 19. Don't worry about, all these warnings that come up. Just use -- force. If you're using a different package manager like Bun, you might not even see this. But here, it's just being a little bit more pedantic, if you will. It's being a little bit more thorough, if you will, in just letting you know that there are some peer dependency issues, but in actuality and in all the projects that I built with Shadcn, it's never been an issue. So you can just hit enter. It's now going to install the dependencies, which I believe the chief one is Radix UI and Lucid React icons. So we both have all of those two packages with our Shadcn install here. It's one of the things that you'll note. A project has Shadcn if you see this components.json. So we'll know that that installation works if we see that. Also, another thing is if we cd into our source directory, you're going to see a library folder that's been put in there. And if we go to library, there's a utils folder. Now, going back to the base, the root of our project here, we are going to need to install our Shadcn component. So if we go back to the documentation, docs, Next.js here, we can start to install things by doing npx Shadcn latest add. And if you wanted specific ones, you can go into, like for example, the button here. You can just scroll down a little bit and see the installation that you would do for each of them. They explain the usage, all of these. What I like to do for most of my projects, and really haven't had a problem in doing so, is just writing npx Shadcn add here. I do see that they have at latest. So if there's a specific version that you want to use, just provide the version number after @ for whatever reason. But we can do npx Shadcn @ latest and then do add. And if you didn't provide something, like here you provide button, you would just install the button. If you do just add like this, it'll pop up a little CLI menu here, and you can actually select which ones that you want to add. Use space to select the different ones. You can also hit space again to deselect them. You can hit A to toggle all of them, and that's what we're going to be doing. So we're going to be selecting all of them, hit enter, and we're going to be installing everything. It's going to have another React 19 force conversation here, and we're just going to hit enter. And now we're going to have access to every single one of these components to use on our project. Okay, opening up our project to take a look at some of our components. You're going to see here a very long list of all of the different Shadcn components. If we go in a button, you can see here that we can actually have access to the source implementation of the button using Radix UI here as a base. And yeah, if you wanted to change any of the variants, any of the tailwind styling for each of the buttons, you can do so. You can also add in extra variants, which in our projects we're going to be doing and adding a couple of them in as we need them. We have size here, so these with height, padding, and width, I believe. None of them seem to have width, except for size, which is size of 9 has both height and width involved in it. You can also change any of the base styling. So if you're not satisfied with any of these, you can just change it there. This gives you total control if you just want to use them the way that it is by default. You're free to do so. But if you're a little bit of a power user and you want to dig a little bit underneath the hood, you have access to all of them here. Now, what we're going to do is just run a little bit of an example here. If we go back to Shadcn UI here, you can see here a little create an account card here. And I think it would be really great if we could implement those and just show the power and the ease in which we can use these Shadcn components. So first, let's break it down and analyze what makes up this kind of login card, if you will. So first, there's the card itself. This little outline here is a card. And if we go into components, scroll down to card, you can see, right, that little outlined shape around our internal UI components is called a card. A card is made up of different parts. There's the header, a title, content, a little description, sorry, I skipped over description underneath the card title, and a footer. And so in this example, right, this would be the title, this would be the description. Both of these are within the header. Then you have card contents here in the middle, and then this might be part of the contents or might be part of the footer. Let's find out. Let's see here. Yep, so there's a footer with the button. So this bottom piece right here is the footer. And then I believe everything from the push notifications down. So let's look for push notifications. Push notifications here, yep, is inside of card content. So I think that would be a great place to start in implementing this create an account. So this is the title. This is the description. These will all go into the contents, and then create account will be in the footer. Every Next.js project starts with some boiler code here within pages.tsx. If we navigate over to the web page itself, this is what it currently looks like. So in order to implement what we want, that kind of login card, we're going to need to remove everything. We're going to remove image here. We're going to add in our card. We'll make sure that you're importing it from @components UI. Next, we're going to need our card header here. And then we need to provide in our card title, which will be create in account. Now, why don't we save this for now and take a look at how it looks within our web page. Looks like it's not taking up what we would expect, right? The form and look of our card. It's kind of extended the full width of the screen, and it's all the way at the top. So we need to position it in the middle, as well as making the card a reasonable size, like in that Shadcn example. So what we're going to do is wrap our card within the div. Just going to stick that in there. And for our div, we're going to do flex, items, center, justify, center, min, height of screen, and width, full. So that should put our card in the middle, but we need to specify a width for our card. I think a reasonable width would be perhaps around 350 pixels. We go back there. That looks about the same size as what we're expecting. You might be wondering why there's an inversion of color here. It's in dark mode. So if we were in light mode, like we are in our application, this is what it would look like. Next up, we need to add in the description here. So let's just copy this in, go back to our project here, do card description, paste that in there, go back. Cool, we have that there. Next up, our GitHub and Google buttons. So now we can put that inside of our contents, if I spelled it right. There we go. Then we're going to need a div here, class name, flex, items, center, justify between, and we're going to have two buttons. Whoops, make sure that you grab it from /UI, or /components UI button. We're going to need to, well, first, let's take a look at how it would look if we didn't style anything. So we provide GitHub here, then another button, capital B button, Google. If we save this and take a look at it, okay, we have a justified between, we have item centered, but it doesn't quite look like what we have here. So how can we do that? Well, one of the things we can do is probably provide a fixed width, so maybe 45% here, and do the same thing for this other button. I'll just copy this here, put that there. Cool. Now the widths look the same. This color matches the black button here, the default button, but these are inverted. And so the variant that provides that is outline. So we're going to do that for both of our buttons here. And if we go back, you can see GitHub and Google. We have our two icons here. Now, for icons, I would say that Lucid React does provide them, but I would prefer using, and I'll just do npm I here, React icons. Hit enter. You're going to see this a couple times when you're using Shadcn. We're going to need to do -- force. So cool. Everything is now in. We're going to do npm run dev to start back up our application. We need each of the icons, so we're going to grab GitHub here. So you can see that it's deprecated from Lucid React, and it does recommend using, let's see here, simple icons, but I would prefer using React icons instead. Doesn't look like it's automatically showing the import for those, so we're going to do import GitHub from what was it, at React icons, or is it just React icons? There we go, /FA, and we need FA Google. Sorry, that's why it didn't pop up. The FA Google, or GitHub, sorry, and by using that, you can see here, let's see, refresh. we have here our little GitHub icon. And now for Google, I actually prefer a colored one, so import FC Google. And I guess that's not going to also auto pop in. So icon/FC. And if we provide FC Google here, a little colored version there. So if we just zoom in there, looks very clean and nice. A slight improvement, if you will, over the existing icons that they have. Next, we need to do the or continue with row there. So we're going to copy, well, not copy, but do something similar. What we're going to do is div here. We're going to do class name, flex, items, center, margin in the vertical direction of 2. Next, we're going to use the separator component, and there's a lot of different imports. The one that we want to use is the @/component/UI separator here. And we're going to just provide that. So if you look at that, how it looks right now, we have a little line going on underneath, similar to the line here. But we need some extra stuff in it, right? So we're going to provide a span here, class name, text of small, or continue with, and then add another separator. So what's going on here? Oh no, it doesn't fit correctly. We need it to look like that. How can we fix that? Also, these were in all caps, so I can just use uppercase, I believe, and that would make everything all caps. They also seem to be text muted foreground. I think they looked a little gray instead of, yeah, something like that. I think they were even smaller, so extra small the other direction. There we go. And what we can do to fix this, super easy, width of 75 pixels. So hopefully you guys enjoy my little over dramatic pretend mistakes there. Now, when we're providing this fixed width, we'd expect that to solve everything, right? That we've told the separator to be 75 pixels, and we should expect that the website should reflect it. But weird, it doesn't. Well, as it turns out, and this is a good showcase of the fact that you can go into Shadcn components and change them as needed, we're going to go into our separator here and find this interesting bit here, where it provides data orientation. When the orientation is horizontal, it's going to be width of full, and somehow that's overriding our hard-coded width value. So what we're going to do is just get rid of this and provide really quick orientation equals horizontal. Then we're going to have a height of 1 pixel and width of full, and height of full, width of 1 pixel when we're vertical. Oh, this needs to be in brackets. There we go. And if we close everything up, go back to our website, we can see, it looks better. We still need to align it correctly, so we can use justify center here to center it. Maybe add a little bit of spacing in between, a gap X of 2. So they're a little bit separated out, and that should make us look a lot more like the Shadcn example. Maybe I made the text a little bit too small with extra small. Let me see if small. I think extra small is more correct. Cool. There should be a little bit more padding, so I'm going to add in a 4 instead. Let's make sure. Yep. That looks about right. Okay, cool. So we can move on to the next part, which is to add in this email, this input field, password, and then finally the footer. Okay, for our next section, it's going to be another div here. We're going to provide class name. We're going to have a column because we're going to have things stacked on top of each other, the labels and the different inputs. So we're going to use, we can actually use the label component here to provide email. And if we just save it and take a look at it real quick, right, there's the label there, just like an email. Then we need the input. So we need the input. We're going to use the input component. And we just reorder these so they're in ABC order. Input, sorry. And we're going to do placeholder m/example.com. Type of email. Use a closing tag there. We're going to provide another label. And this one will be password. And then this one will have also another input, but there is no placeholder, and type will be of password. So not actually anything with the actual implementation. I'm just concerned about the UI. So these inputs don't really do anything. You can see there they are, and they mirror what we can see here in the Shadcn example. Lastly, we need the footer. So here we have card footer provided here. We're going to do a button, and we're going to do create account. And when we take a look at our button here, it looks valid. It's not quite what is provided here. We need to provide an extra styling to our button. Class name width of full. And if we go back, okay, great. Our thing looks pretty much the same, except for I think we have better icons. So just zoom it in, make it look better, or look bigger. On this side too. Whoops. Okay, we lose it if I make it too big. So you can see there, that's the Shadcn example. That's our example. I think it all looks great. Hopefully you've now figured out how we can use Shadcn, and hope to see you use it in your own projects. Authentication is the gatekeeper of your app, responsible for identifying users and protecting sensitive data. Choosing the right auth solution is critical, and that's where Better-Auth comes into play. Better-Auth simplifies the complex task of auth, offering developers a streamlined and secure solution. Instead of spending hours configuring auth from scratch, Better-Auth provides a ready-to-go system that's easy to integrate, reliable, and secure by default. Best of all, it's in TypeScript, which is super important for type safety and avoiding tricky bugs in your auth. If you're new to app development, it's best to keep things simple by using trusted providers like GitHub or Google. Most people have a Gmail or GitHub account, and this significantly reduces the complexity of managing user credentials. By relying on these established services, you can minimize potential security risks and save valuable development time. But why specifically use Better-Auth with Next.js? Better-Auth pairs perfectly with Next.js's server-side rendering capabilities, offering seamless integration with Next.js's APIs and middleware. This means smoother implementation, better performance, and enhanced security, tailored specifically for Next.js applications. In short, Better-Auth isn't just convenient, it's the best way, in my opinion, to handle authentication in your Next.js applications. We need to install Better-Auth. So first, we're going to go into installation here. We're going to see that there are various different options to use different package managers. I'm going to be using npm for this project again. So we are going to copy this command here. You can select over it and copy it if you prefer to do that. We're going to go into our IDE here where our project is residing. We're going to paste in npm install Better-Auth here. So we appear to have a dependency issue. This is from React 19. And once we've installed Shadcn, this type of error is going to pop up over and over and over again. All that you have to do to fix it, as it says here, we can either fix it, which we personally can't, or we can just retry the command with -- force. I personally have had 0 problems with this. There might be a corner case in which it becomes an issue, but for 99.999% of circumstances, you're not going to see a problem. So for the future, remember to use -- force here if you're using it in conjunction with Shadcn, like we are in this tutorial. Cool. So we have it installed. the next step is we need to set our environment variables. So it says here to create .environment. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a new file and do .environment. And then inside of here, we need to first generate a secret key here and then use it in our project. And we can do that by pasting it all into .environment. For a lot of these environment variables, I'd recommend copy and pasting it in, not typing it in or trying to transcribe it. If you make a mistake in transcribing your secret key and you use it within your code base, unlike syntax errors, which might be highlighted, any error between or mismatch between an environment variable and how you call it and use it inside of your project, you're not going to detect it. And then there's going to be a lot of connection issue errors that pop up that you're going to think are related to your code, but nope, it's actually because of your environment variables. So I'm definitely going to recommend that you use some form of copy in order to transcribe your environment variables as opposed to directly typing each one of them in. In the next step, we need to set our base URL. Since we're currently in development and not in production, our URL is going to be localhost 3000. When we actually deploy our production app, this .environment is not going to be carried on. It's not going to be uploaded onto GitHub. And so in the new environment variables that we provide, we need to provide whatever final URL, either the one provided by our hosting service or a custom domain that we have purchased. Okay, so we need to copy this and put it into our environment variables here. Easy. Next step, we need to create a Better-Auth instance inside of our project. And they provide a bunch of different potential locations where we can put this auth.ts, the project root, library folder, or utils. Personally, in my opinion, since this is a external library, I'm going to be putting it into the library folder. I used to put it in my project root, similar to how I used to do it with Next.js. But for Better-Auth, since it's all in one file, I think it would make more sense and look a little bit easier if I put it in the lib folder. So what we can do is just copy this auth.ts. As you can see here, there's an ellipsis here. There's going to be a lot more code that we're going to be putting in it. But for right now, we just need to get this starter piece of code. So let's copy this. Shifting over to the IDE, we have our library folder here. We're going to create a new file, auth.ts, and we're going to paste in that starter code that they gave us. In order to do authorization, we need to store user data. When someone logs in, we need to store that new account that is being created. And to do that, we need to have a database. We're going to configure the database in a second because I want to wrap up all the things related to auth first. So we're going to skip this step for now. We'll come back to it in a second. What we can do in the meanwhile is to set up our various authorization methods. I personally believe that for beginners, you shouldn't be dealing with email password for yourself. There's a lot of messiness there that new developers shouldn't really handle. I think it would be a lot better to use trusted providers like GitHub and Google for authentication. So let's start with GitHub here, as they have it listed here. You can find all of the different social media sign-on accounts that you can use. We're going to be focusing on GitHub and Google because those are generally, for developers and for regular people, the most popular options. With GitHub, we have to get GitHub credentials, and that requires you to have a GitHub account. So let's jump over into the browser and log into GitHub real quick. Okay, we're in GitHub here. We're going to open up the panel here to go to our settings. Then we're going to scroll all the way down before we get to developer settings. Make sure you're not creating a GitHub app, you're creating an OAuth app. And we're going to click here to create our new one. Generally in GitHub, I'll create two different versions of the OAuth app for my websites. One of them is for development and one of them is for test. And the reason for that is this authorization callback URL. If we go back to the Better-Auth documentation, it says here that we need to set our redirect URL to localhost 3000 API auth callback GitHub. So basically, when it asks GitHub for a user's information, because GitHub is going to be processing for you the login, it needs a place to redirect you back. Basically, this callback here. And so on development, we're going to be running localhost 3000, like the base URL that we set earlier. But here, we only have room for one callback URL. And so if we have one for our development, well, we obviously can't point it back to localhost 3000. That's only for development. We need whatever our development production domain is. And so that's what the second OAuth app is for. It's for our production domain that we're going to be providing. So usually I'll just create, right, if the name of the project, for example, was tutorial, right, then I would create tutorial-test for the localhost one, the one that we're going to be using during development, and then create another one for the production app. So to fill out the rest of it, the homepage URL, http://localhost 3000. And then we can just go back here, copy this bit here. This is our callback URL, as they call it here. They call it the redirect URL. Both are equivalent, right? Once we have all of this filled out, we can register the application. Now be very careful with the next steps, because when you generate this client secret and for some reason you navigate from this page, you get disconnected from the internet, you're not going to be able to see this. You're going to need to generate a new client secret. It's a whole hassle to do so. So get it right on the first run. So if we go back to the Better-Auth documentation, it'll show us how we can configure the provider. So what we're going to do is just copy this portion here into our code base, right? So where we have this commented out ellipses, we're just going to paste in social providers, right? First, we're going to have GitHub here, and for some reason there's some extra tabs. So just pretty that up a little bit. You don't actually have to do that, but I'll do it just to make it look better. We need our client, GitHub client ID and GitHub client secret. So first, we'll deal with the client ID because it's less tricky. Make sure that these are consistent between what we have in our environment variables here and what we have in auth. So what we're going to do is just copy this, paste it here, then go into GitHub, grab our client ID here, hit equals, paste that in there. Then the next step, GitHub client secret, and save that. Go back into our GitHub dashboard here for our OAuth app. We're going to generate a new client secret. And then, see this, make sure to copy your new client secret now. You won't be able to see it again. You'd have to delete it and then create another one. So, copy, all right, and go back into our dot environment, paste it in there. Make sure that you're pasting everything. Don't transcribe anything. You don't want any inadvertent mistakes to derail you. And these environment variable errors are really hard to suss out. And so, yeah, make sure that you're just copy pasting everything. Make life easier for you. The last step just explains to you how you're going to be signing in with GitHub. So we'll save that for when we revisit our login page. Now we're going to be going on to implementing Google credentials. Now, Google's developer experience is challenging to say the least, and we're going to be using Google Cloud Console. You're going to have to follow me. I'll try to go as slow as I can through all the different steps. There's a lot of them, and it's not the most clear and straightforward way like GitHub, but since Google has so many users, and most likely most people have some form of Gmail account, it's pretty important that we do it. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so here's a quick search for Google Cloud Console here. It's the second result here. You're looking for cloud.google.com, Cloud Console here. So we're just going to click on this. This will take you directly to it, but in case you wanted to do a little bit of read up about Google Cloud and all that stuff, we're really only going to be using Auth in this tutorial. So we can just start for free here. It'll take you to your login. You're going to need to have some form of Gmail account, whether it's G Suite or a regular Gmail account. So feel free to create one and then sign in. Okay, so when you come onto the Google Cloud screen for the first time, it's going to say all of the Google Cloud products. Again, you don't need that. We only need Auth. So unlike GitHub, Google requires that you put in a credit card before you access Google Cloud, and we need Google Cloud in order to do Auth. So if you are a bit concerned and don't want to put in a credit card information in, or you don't have one, then feel free to skip this. For people who want to continue, just note you won't be charged unless you activate your full pay-as-you-go account or choose to prepay. We're not going to be doing any of that stuff, so unless they change something in the future, you will not be charged. So you put in your payments information, and I'll skip to the step after it for obvious reasons, not to share out my personal payment information. Okay, so once you're finished with all the random billing related stuff, you'll be approached with your dashboard. It's really intense. There's a lot of junk on it, if I'm being completely honest, and Google's not the best at designing stuff, but we can just click out of all of this stuff. We're going to go over to the navigation menu here, and what we are specifically looking for is in APIs and services, we're looking for the OAuth consent screen here. So we're going to click that first. Is in API and services, we're looking for OAuth consent screen here. Click on that. It'll be taking you to here. And then we need to configure our Google Auth platform. So we're going to hit get started here. We need to provide a app name, right? So for our app, we're just going to call it tutorial. Provide the email that you use to log in as the user support email. Next, we're going to select external here. You're going to have to push it to live, but honestly, I haven't faced any issues with production apps with actually having to move it out of test. I wonder if it's a certain amount of users that you have to break through, but that's a problem that I'm sure you can have one of your employees take care of if you ever become big enough. So for now, just using external is fine. Then for contact information, you can provide the same one as you used to log in. So there's that one. And then we agree to their terms and services. You can check it out there. Continue for some reason. And hit create. Great. And then we need to create a OAuth client here. So we have an application type, web application in our case. Then the name of the app. So we've already provided a name before, tutorial. Obviously name it whatever you want for your own project. This is just an internal product, so product name. And so for us, we can just call it tutorial, test 1, whatever we want to name it. And then for authorized JavaScript origins and redirect URIs, just provide the same things as we put in GitHub. So for the URI, https://localhost 3000. And the thing I do like about Google, and probably the only redeeming factor, is that I don't have to create a bunch of different OAuth client IDs for a bunch for development or production. I can keep it all the same by just adding additional URIs. So makes it a lot easier. Then next here, we're going to go really quickly back to Better-Auth here, and we are going to copy the corresponding redirect URL for Google here. We're going to add it in as the authorized redirect URI here, and then we're going to hit create. And then here is our client ID, so we need to click on that to copy it, go back into our code base. Actually, before we do that, real quick, let's grab this chunk here from the Better-Auth documentation, right? So we just move down a little bit to step 2 here, grab this piece, go into auth.ts, and put it underneath GitHub here. Oh my gosh, the styling from this copy is terrible. So cool. Then we just copy in Google Client ID, enter, and then we can actually do the same really quick for Google Client Secret. Enter. Go back to our Google screen here, copy this. Again, copy, don't rewrite it. You're definitely going to make a mistake and then regret it later. And then now we need to generate our secret. Okay. For whatever reason, it doesn't automatically show you the secret. You have to go into edit OAuth client or just click on it, right? You'll be taken to this screen. Then you'll just have your secret here. And unlike GitHub, you won't worry, it's always going to be there. So feel free to use it as you see fit. So great. Now we have both GitHub and Google configured. Now we need to make sure that our project works with Next.js. So let's go back over to the documentation here. Let's scroll down to integrations and then choose Next.js. So one of the first things here that we have to do is to create an API route to use it with Next.js. So we're going to copy this piece of code and just note this directory path that we have to add in. So where API goes is inside of our app folder here. So source app, we're going to add a new folder, API, and then we're going to create a nested folder inside of there with auth, another folder with a square bracket to catch all here, and then a new file, route.ts, which we can paste in the information that we provided. Here they used @lib/auth, another reason to put your auth in libs. Okay, now we can move on to creating a client. We need to create a client instance. That way we can use the sign in and sign out methods that are available to us from Better-Auth. All right, back over to the documentation. After we've created our API route, we need to create a client instance. Here, it recommends creating a auth client.ts file, put it inside of our library directory here. So all we need to do is copy the code here, go back to our code base, inside of our lib folder here, add in a new file, auth, -client.ts, paste that code in there, and we're ready to move on to the next step. We don't need any client configurations here. You're welcome to look at the documentation, and if you'd like to provide any, you're certainly welcome to. I believe that they put an extra space there. Strange. So yeah, let's move on to the next step. Back into the documentation, we're hitting a very important piece here, React server components and server actions. We don't use any server actions in this tutorial, or really any of my tutorials, to be completely honest. You're certainly welcome to use server actions if you'd like, and if you think it improves your code. But for me, I'm going to specifically be using React server components. So we can skip this portion here, move on down to this example here. In this example, they provide an example server component. Here we can see that this function is an asynchronous function. Here it's because getSession returns a promise, so we need to invoke await here to wait for the promise to resolve. We're making an API call over to our database and checking it to see if the user is currently authorized or not, if they're logged in as well. We have headers here, which is to resolve the response headers that we get back. And we get the user session data. In this conditional here, we are making an evaluation. If sessions exists, we fall through with this not Here, if there's not of session of undefined, then we're not authenticated. Here, they're choosing to conditionally render things based off of if a person is authenticated. If they are, then we're able to get the user's name. Sometimes, and most often in my tutorial, you'll want to redirect the user, often to the login page if they're not authenticated and they're trying to access a page that requires authentication. So we'll often redirect them from that page. You could also display an error state by saying you're not authenticated, you need to log in, here's a login button to then go over to login. So it's certainly up to you and how you want to design your website to handle these unauthorized, authorized potential redirects, such as if you're on the landing page. The converse would be, if you're on a landing page, it's typically a public website, but if a user is already logged in, we might want to punt them over to the internal homepage for an authorized user. Then we can do a redirect to any form of authorized page. So we're not going to have to really worry about the rest of this, server action, cookies, any middleware. Us using Auth with Google and GitHub, they take care of most of that for us. So we're only going to need to be worrying about implementing this in our code. But before we actually get to implementing authorization, remember we skipped the database earlier. So we're going to do a little bit of cleanup of some of our front end so that we can do a little demonstration of login and ensuring that we can properly query our database. So let's jump back into the code and clean up some things. Going into our code here, we're going to close all the stuff that we don't need for now. So inside of our home page here, this looks like a good start for a login page. So we're going to make a quick transfer. We're going to create a route to login here. We're going to move this page.tsx into the newly created route of login here. So we're going to move it. We need to rename this because this is no longer the home page. This is now the login page. And I don't typically use function components, so we're going to switch this to an error function. Might as well do it now while we're doing a little bit of spring cleaning. We are going to change this from, we're not going to use email and password per my recommendations earlier. We're going to use GitHub and Google. So here we're going to say using your preferred auth provider. Or actually, instead of saying auth provider, we'll just say using your preferred login method, GitHub or Google. We can remove all this bit about the email and password, and we can get rid of the card footer. Consequently, we're going to get rid of some of the imports here. Great. Then we need a landing page here. A div. This is the landing page. So remember, in the URL, this would be at slash, right? The login page would be at slash login. And oh, that reminds me, I need to export default this as well. Export default login page. Let's add in export default landing page here before we forget. Then we need to add in a home page to finish out this login demo that we're going to do to test everything out. So we're going to create a home route here. Then we're going to create page.tsx and then do const home page here. And we're going to need this one, return a div. Inside of it, this is the home page. And just to remember, it will be at slash home in the URL for this page. All right, let's make sure that we export default this one as well. And we'll be ready to move on. Whoops, export default home page. What is NeonDB? NeonDB is a serverless PostgreSQL database designed specifically for modern web apps. Being serverless means it automatically handles infrastructure, scaling, and database management tasks, allowing developers to focus on app logic without having to worry about manual configurations or maintenance. NeonDB utilizes branching and instant provisioning, making it particularly suited for fast-paced development environments that require rapid testing, development, and scalability. Drizzle ORM complements NeonDB effectively because it's lightweight, type-safe, and built specifically for JavaScript and TypeScript applications. It simplifies interactions with your database by providing clear, intuitive syntax and robust type inference, reducing boilerplate and minimizing potential runtime errors. Additionally, Drizzle seamlessly integrates with Neon's modern serverless architecture, enabling efficient and performant database queries without sacrificing ease of use. To get started with Neon, we have to first create an account and then create our first database. We can start the process by hitting sign up here on their homepage. Then you can choose which authorization method you'd like to use to create your account with: Google, GitHub, Microsoft, or any email provider that you might have. I'm going to use Google to sign in. After you finish signing up, you might be taken to this dashboard page, or you'll be taken to a Create Projects page that looks like this. If you were taken to the dashboard and you want to get to Create Projects, you can hit the Create Project button here in the middle of the dashboard. On this Create Projects name, you can name the project, which is going to hold all of your databases. For the first one, I'm just going to call this YouTube Tutorials. And then for database name, I'm going to name it NeonDB. Feel free to name it whatever you'd like to fit with whatever tutorial that you're currently working on, whatever project in the future you're going to be working on. Just remember, databases, the database name is for a name of a specific database. Project name is for all of the databases that are related to a particular project. You can choose which version of Postgres you'd like to use. For my tutorials, I'm going to be using Postgres version 17. That's the latest one that's available. And we can choose our cloud service provider, AWS or Azure. The primary difference is when it comes to using either AWS or Azure on Neon is the location of the servers that is going to be housing your Neon database. So, whether, on Azure, Virginia, Frankfurt, and Arizona versus AWS and all of these, you can choose which one that makes the most sense for you and the users, the most likely users who are going to be using your product. For me, I'm just going to be using AWS US East 2, Ohio. And we're going to hit create, and that'll create our first database. So under YouTube tutorials here, you can see that we have our database. In order to use your new database, we're going to select the option Connect to your database here. Clicking on that will pop open a little modal that'll show you your unique connection string. This connection string is unique to this particular database, and please treat this connection string as privileged information. I'm going to be deleting this database after the tutorial, so please don't use this specific string. Create your own. And for a connection string that you have, ensure that you keep it private, because this connection string allows for anybody who has it to connect to your database. And if you don't want someone out there maliciously using your database, putting a bunch of stuff into it and leaving you on the hook for a large compute and store bill, then you need to keep this private. To utilize our connection string, you can either select over it and hit copy here, or you can just hit copy snippet, which will copy it over to your clipboard. Then we can go into our code here, go into our environment variables. I'm just going to do this in ABC order. Create database URL and paste in the connection string here. So make sure that you spell database URL correctly. Again, you don't want really weird errors, and lo and behold, it's because you misspelled database URL. We're going to be exploring Drizzle ORM, a modern tool that makes working with databases a breeze, especially if you're familiar with SQL. If you have ever felt bogged down by repetitive queries or complex database interactions, Drizzle ORM might just be the tool you need. First off, what exactly is an ORM? ORM stands for Object Relational Mapping. It's a technique that lets you interact with your database using the programming language you're already coding in, instead of writing raw SQL queries. That means you can treat your tables like objects and rows like instances, making your code cleaner and more maintainable. In a lot of my tutorials, we're going to be using TypeScript, and so type safety is an important aspect of our projects and the work that we're going to be doing. And so, by using Drizzle ORM, we can make type-safe database queries. So why choose Drizzle specifically? Drizzle ORM is a lightweight, type-safe, and designed for modern JavaScript and TypeScript environments. It helps you write database code that's both easy to understand and robust. Plus, it integrates smoothly with popular frameworks, like the ones that we use, Next.js, which makes it a great choice for developers who want to keep their stack lean and efficient. Drizzle ORM brings several cool features to the table. It offers a fluent API that feels natural to use, strong typing for fewer runtime errors, and it's designed to handle complex queries in a straightforward way. I'm always surprised at the different kind of methods and queries that I can do that I never thought would be possible under Drizzle ORM. I always feel like I need to dip into the SQL to be able to do it, but nope, they've got a lot of built-in functions for me to use. You get all the benefits of a modern ORM without some crazy overhead. Using Drizzle ORM is pretty simple. You define your schema using JavaScript or TypeScript objects, and Drizzle handles the rest. Need to query some data? Just call the appropriate methods and you'll get your results without having to write a single line of SQL. This makes development faster and less error prone. We're here now in the Drizzle ORM documentation. We can hit get started here. We're using Neon here, and we have a couple of commands to use in order to install Neon, as well as Drizzle ORM. So we have to still deal with the React 19 issues. So we're going to have to use -- force along with any console installations. So we're going to select over it and hit Control C to copy it. Go into our terminal here, paste it in there, and then write in -- force. So make sure that we install Drizzle ORM, Neon, and .environment, which we'll be using later on. While that's installing, I'm just going to go back to our documentation here, copy over this installation command, copy it. Now that this one's done, I'm going to paste this one in, -- force again, hit enter, and install that one. Great. Going back to the documentation, we've already taken care of step 2. Inside of our .environment folder, we already have our database URL. So step 2 is done. Moving on to step 3 here. They're asking us to create an index.ts file in the source/db directory. And then we have to initialize our connection to our database. Switching over to our IDE again. Let's clean things up, close everything down so we can focus specifically on our database. Let's close our app folder. And at the source level here, we're going to right-click New Folder here and add one, DB, as they instruct. Inside of this database folder, we're going to add a new file, index.ts, and then we're going to paste in the code that they provide. Make sure that you are providing this top one, not this bottom one. Now, it's going to say argument of type string or undefined is not assignable to type string and a bunch of other things. So the reason for that is that there's no assurances that this environment variable exists inside of our environment folder here. technically the IntelliSense doesn't know. And so what we can do is just assure it by making sure ourselves that we put it in there. We can just provide this explicit operator here that basically says, yes, this either exists, or we can cast it as string. Technically a little bit dangerous, but as long as we make sure that we have our database URL, this will be fine. And then lastly, I'm going to amend their code a little bit by adding an export so that we can actually utilize the database in other files. Make sure that you've pasted in this code, not this one. Cool. Going back over to the documentation, moving on from step 3 to step 4, we need to create a schema for our project. Now, this first part of the schema needs to be what we're providing in Better-Auth. Now, they do have a bit here about how to work with Drizzle, which requires using their CLI tool. In my experience, it produces not the best formatted code. So I think you're better off just recreating it manually. Also, it'll give you a better understanding of all the pieces that are available to you in this authorization tool. So we're going to go back to installation here. We're going to go to create database tables, and then scroll on down until you see this little note here. We want to create the schema manually. So we're going to hit this database section. And now we have each of the individual pieces that we're going to have to add. So this will give us a great opportunity as well to introduce some of the key Drizzle concepts while also looking at the Better-Auth concepts. So let's start here with what a user is with Better-Auth. So they have an access to a unique ID, which means that we can search for a particular user by their ID. We have a user's chosen display name. That's the one that they provide to GitHub or Google. The email, same thing, just for their email. If their email has been verified or not, that'll be a Boolean, true or false. Some form of image. Here it's optional, marked optional, because there could be an image, could not. For example, if you never provided an image to GitHub, then you would just have the basic profile picture. Same goes for Gmail. Created at, and then updated at. You can read here the timestamp of when the user account was created, for created at, updated at, timestamp of the last update to the user's information, just in case you need it. So now we're going to add this into our project schema. So to do that, we're going to jump back into our code here. We're going to close this stuff out. We're going to add in our DB folder here a new file, schema.ts. So we're going to provide export const user, and it's going to be our first Postgres table. So we're going to use PG table here, grab it from Drizzle ORM /PG core. We need to provide a name for this table, so we're just going to name it user. And then inside of this, we're going to provide the ID, which will be of type text. Now, there's a lot of different sources for a text. We are looking for specifically the same one where we pulled this PG table, Drizzle ORM /PG core. So an easier way than just adding one via the tab here would just be adding it up here. So that's what I'm going to do from now on. We're going to need to provide the label ID to it, and this is going to be the primary key that we use to search users. We're going to need the name here of type text name, and then we're going to provide not null, so it's not optional. When we get to images, we're going to omit not null. Next, we're going to provide our email, text of email, not null, just copying through all of these. We need to make sure that this email is unique. So unlike name, which some people might have the same display name, we want to make sure that the email is unique. Here, the ID, we've already declared it a primary key, and so each ID should be unique anyways. We're going to have email verified, which will be of type Boolean. And then, so we're going to need to add Boolean up top here. Boolean true or false. Email underscore verified. not null, image, text, image, created at, which will be of type timestamp. So that's a new thing. We're going to have to add that up here. Timestamp, which will be basically a date object. Created at, not null. And finally updated at, which will be a timestamp updated underscore at, not null. Great. So we have our user. After users, we are concerned with the current session. So we have an ID for the session. We have a user ID. So this is a key that refers to this user. So it creates a relation between this sessions table with a particular user. There is a session token when the session expires, the IP address of the device, the user agent information of the device, if available, and then, again, created at and updated at. So now we're going to add that to our schema. So let's switch over to our code here. And we're going to create another table. I'm going to go a little bit faster now since we've already created one table. PG table, name it session, ID, text, ID, primary key, user ID, text, user ID. Whoops, not null. And this is going to be a reference. We're going to provide a reference here to the user table and specifically to the ID. And we're going to have an onDelete be cascading. So basically, if a user in this table has a relation to a session, so that means that session belongs to one of the users. If that user gets deleted from our database, then it's going to cascade and delete the sessions as well. Next, token, text, token, not null, and this is going to be unique here. We're going to have expires at timestamp, expires at, not null, IP addresses, which will be of type text, IP addresses, and this is optional, so no, not null. User agent, text user underscore agent here, and then created at and updated at, we'll just copy paste it from here. Great. So up to this point, this is what our schema.ts should look like. Let's move on to the next part. Okay, so I believe that I transcribed all of the individual pieces. They were all, for the most part, pretty easy to translate over to Drizzle. And we've reused a lot of these already, so sorry for moving that there. So yeah, feel free to take some time to copy it over. Make sure that you have everything in there before we move on to the next step. Once you're finished transcribing that, we can go back to our documentation. We're basically done with Better-Auth. We can go back to Drizzle ORM, move on from step 4 here on to step 5. We need to set up a Drizzle config file here, and Drizzle config here, as it states, a config file that is used by DrizzleKit, the CLI tool that they use, that they've created at Drizzle, that contains all the information about your database, connection, migration folder, schemas, and DrizzleKit allows for you to perform changes to the database, as seen here, push, and the more safer version, generate and migrate. So let's set up this Drizzle config file. Let's copy it and jump over to code. So it's asking us to create the drizzle config.ts file in the root of our project. So what is the root of our project? If we close this out, close everything, the root is all of these files here. So just outside and all the way at the bottom here, we're going to do drizzle.config.ts, and then we'll paste in this code here. Make sure that we have everything that we need. .environment config, define config. Make sure that the schema that you put is in the right location. So it's looking for source, DB, and then the schema.ts file. We're using PostgresSQL, and then process.environment database _ URL. So make sure that you spelled it correctly in your .environment folder file, so that we don't have any sort of connection errors. Great. So now we can move on, and looking at step 6 here, let's try to generate this and then apply the migrations. The safer version, you technically do push, but push is not safe. It's used for quickly testing new schema designs, but in actual production, it's safer to use generate and migrate. It checks for errors, and you'll need to use fine-grained SQL controls. I suppose in an MVP, it's totally fine to push, but if you're working with a teammate might not be happy if you push and clobber over their changes. Generate and migrate, you might be able to roll back a particular change. Okay, we can go into our terminal, npx drizzle kit generate. This is always a last opportunity for us to take a look at our schema, make sure that we don't have any overlapping ones, make sure that everything looks correctly, just checking it against the table real quick and allowing for everyone to take one last look at this schema that we've created. Scrolling through slowly, feel free to pause to take a look at it. Everything looks about right to me, no duplicate ones. Everything has a primary key. Cool. There's a triple check there. You can now hit npx drizzle generate. You can see we have a table here, 13 columns, 8 columns, 7 columns, and 6 columns. Great, 4 tables. It will generate from our schema.ts here a resulting drizzle or a resulting SQL file. So you can look through here, and if you're curious, you can see how it translates to SQL. Very often, you might want to check it to make sure that all of the SQL is correct, but for me personally, until you get to some of the advanced features of Drizzle, generally its tool is able to generate properly. So if you're just sticking to the basic Boolean, timestamp, text, you should be totally fine. So next, after we're done generating, we can do npx drizzle kit migrate. Everything looks to be working fine. We can switch over to our Neon dashboard here, go into our tables here, and we're able to see that our 4 tables have been created, along with all of the columns that we have declared in our schema file. So great, we now have our database connected. We have all the tables that we require for Better-Auth, and we know now how to use Drizzle ORM. And if we need to add more things to our schema, we totally can. So now let's go back to our demo, test it out, see if we can adequately log in. Let's give a brief basic usage overview of Better-Auth. So here they're going to use GitHub as an example, but remember that we added both GitHub and Google. So when we conduct a sign-in here, we're going to be using our auth client that we created in @lib auth client. The way that we can get it follows this particular schema here. So the ID of the provider, it's a plain text string that you provide. So we're going to be using GitHub and Google. So we're going to provide GitHub and Google for the appropriate sign-in function call. Then we're going to need a URL to redirect after the user authenticates with the provider. So we're going to go over to home afterwards. So by default, it goes to slash. But remember, for us in our landing page, it's going to be the public side. So we're going to be going to slash home. Here they do slash dashboard. A URL to redirect if an error occurs during the sign-in process. So if you'd like to create an error state and put it under your own route, you're welcome to do so. A URL to redirect if the user is newly registered. This can take you over to a onboarding page, so that's really useful there. And then we can also disable the automatic redirect to the provider. So that's by default false, but if you need to set up an automatic redirect, then you can leave that to true. In this tutorial, we're not going to touch this one. We're mostly going to be concerned with these two, the provider and then the callback function. We're not going to provide an error state because it does have one by default, but if you wanted to provide a custom one, you're certainly welcome to do so. Then on the sign out side here, we also have another asynchronous function here, awaiting a sign out. We have our fetch options on success. When we sign out, we need to go somewhere. We can either redirect to the login page, which in my personal opinion, it's kind of weird because if someone just signed out, would they want to sign in again? Potentially, maybe to a different account. For me personally, I push people to the landing page to just demonstrate to them that they're fully logged out. But I also think that in some cases, pushing someone to the login, also totally valid. Now, you'll see here, right, that we're using router here. And in this one, it's already a part of the function to redirect. But in both of these cases, invoking this function, you're generally going to do that on the click of a button. And so on clicks in React generally are done in client components. So we're going to need to separate out a bit of our code into client components when it comes to signing in and signing out. So we'll do that in a little bit. But yep, once we do that, we're going to need to separate these out into client components. On the pages themselves, we are going to be grabbing the session data. Now we can do it on the client side, but we're going to need to do some server side things on our pages. So we're going to be worrying about using get session here. So you can see here that they're creating a way to get your sessions awaiting the get sessions function invocation, passing in the headers. We can create a little wrapper around this to have a common function so we don't have to write this in every single one of our files. So let's jump into the code and do that real quick. All right, so for our demo, let's go back and take a look at the specific pages here. And something that we're going to need to add is a way to actually get to our login page from our landing page, and then maybe a button for us to sign out of. So, and also hook up authorization as well. Okay, so here in the landing page, we're going to need to provide a link from next/link here. Provide an href, which will be going over to login. And then inside of here, we'll just add in a button from Shadcn components and put inside of our button log in. So let's just take a look at that real quick. Okay, we have a login button, but let's make this look a little bit better. Flex items, center, min, height, screen. Let's just check on the login. Anything else that we need? Justify center with the full. Okay, I'll just copy that so that we have a full screen here. And let's just save that. Make sure, okay, everything is there. We just need to do flex column so that things are right on top of each other. That looks great. Let's make sure that we can hit the login button here. Okay, great. That takes us over to our login screen. And then obviously when we log in, we'll be taken to home. And then I will actually copy paste this bit. Well, this bit here first into our home. Just for, again, this is for demo purposes. We're going to need to create a specific component. And so in our components here, we're going to create a new folder here for auth to create a sign out button. Sign out button.tsx. The reason that we need to create a separate one is that it's going to be a client component. Okay, so back into our code here, we're going to go to library, we're going to go to our auth.ts file here. We're going to need to add in a couple of things. From the documentation inside of the Drizzle information, we're going to need to provide our database. So we're just going to copy this bit here, go into our Better-Auth instance here, paste it in there. We need to provide both of these. We can just copy the imports from here. So this one's correct, but the DB is from a different location. Let's import, for some reason it's not auto importing DB from @/DB. There we go. We are not using SQLite, we're using Postgres, so make sure that you make that change. Then we're going to need to provide a page to let Better-Auth know where our login is going to be. So it's going to be on the login route, so make sure that you write it correctly. Login here. And then lastly, we're going to do export const get session. So we're going to create a helpful wrapper function, async auth API get session headers await headers. We're going to grab that from next/headers, bring that up here. And that is a function. Cool. So now inside of our pages, we can do get sessions and determine whether or not the user is authorized or not. Okay, now let's update the UI so that we can incorporate some of the authorization specific code so that we can perform the demo. After we finished creating our schema, we can then add it in to the Drizzle instance that we've created inside of index.ts. So we're going to just provide import star as schema from @/db/ or actually we can just do ./schema since we're not going to be moving these away from each other. So now we can just provide in schema to here. And we need to wrap schema within an object. Once we save that, we should be all set. Let's add in export const sign out button here. Then upon a successful sign out, we're going to need to navigate the user. And in our case, we're going to navigate him to the login screen. So we're going to do const router is equal to use router. So we're going to call the use router hook. This first one, next/router, is for page routers. We're using app router, so we're not going to use this one. We're going to use the one from next/navigation. You can see here, this one's for app router. And for this specific example, to use inside of a client component, we've used the use client directive here to declare that sign out button is a client component. So we need to use the second one. Make sure you don't make that mistake. So there, we've called the hook there to get our router instance. Then next, we need to get a neat sign out method, which will be an asynchronous arrow function here, awaiting the result of auth client. Grab that from @/lib auth client. Let's just move these into ABC order. Dot sign out there. Sign out takes in an object with our fetch options, which also is another object here on success. So when we're successful in our sign out, we're going to do router.push over to login. Great. Whoops. Okay, comma, semicolon. And then I'm going to provide the rest of the contents of our sign out button here. Make sure that you're grabbing it from @/components UI button. Great. And then for our on-click, and click here, we're going to have sign out. And then variant, just to make it look different than the earlier login button, we're going to use variant of outline. Great. And provide sign out. Great. So make sure that we have everything in here that we need for a sign out button. Then in our home page, we're adding a sign out button. Okay, great. Next, we're going to implement some authorization to our pages here. So starting with the landing page, let me just reorder this. This is going to be a public page. And so if the user is logged in already, then they're going to be kicked over to the home page. If they're unauthorized, then they can just stay on the landing page. For the login page, it's a public page, obviously, for login. But if you're already logged in, then it's going to kick you to home. And then home is going to be the private page. If you navigate to home and you're not authorized, it's going to kick you over to login. And obviously, if you are authorized, it should display all this information, allow for you to sign out, which will ultimately kick you to the login page. So let's implement that. Okay, starting with the landing page here. So what we're going to do is first make this asynchronous. If you remember, our getSession function was asynchronous. So we need to grab the promise from it and evaluate it so we can get a valid sessions object. Look if here, if you did not do await, you'd be getting a promise, which you can't use. So here, by evaluating it, we can do the same check as was described in the documentation. If session does exist, we're going to call the redirect function here, grab it from next/navigation. I don't know what this one is. Use this one. This one's the navigation one. Can be used in server components, which this one is, so that we can make this one asynchronous. Cool. So we're going to redirect and go over to home. So if the user is authorized, then there will be a session instance. And in this session instance, if it exists, then we're going to redirect to home. Otherwise, we're just going to flow through to the landing page. Great. On the login, well, we've used the useClient directive here. And so we're going to need to extract some of these pieces out of here, as well as implementing sign-in. So let me skip that for now. Let's go over to home. So home is going to be the opposite of what we did on the landing page. So we're going to grab session here, get, await, get session. We have an error because I did not make this asynchronous. Let's order this in ABC order. And then if not session, so if a session does not exist for the user, we're going to redirect them to the login screen. Let's bring that to the top just to get everything in ABC order. Great. Okay, now on to the login. We're going to have to modify our landing page here to be a server component. And so we're going to have to do a little bit of refactoring to change this from a client component. So the first thing that we can do is get rid of this useClient declaration there. We're going to have to move this portion into its own component. So we're going to go into auth here, and we're going to create a new file, login buttons.tsx. This is going to be a client component. Use client at the top. Export const login buttons, and we're going to return this bit here. Let's make this look better. Great. And we're going to need some imports. So let me go back here, retrieve these imports from the login page. So I'm just cutting and pasting these in here, and I cut in the wrong place. There we go. Great. So everything looks right. And so now we can just call login buttons. There we go. Was waiting for that tab option. Cool. So there we go. If we go over to the code, we refresh. Yep, everything looks the same on the login. Wonderful. So let's add in the same thing that we had within our landing page. So this is a public page, but if the user is already logged in, then we'd redirect them to home. They don't need to do the login again. If they wanted to log in with a different account, for example, then they'd have to sign out, get back to the login, and then log in with a different account. Great. So now going back over to the login page, we need to create two sign-ins. So sign in with GitHub and a const sign in with Google. We're going to start back up with GitHub here, and we're going to do async arrow function await auth client. So import that from /lib auth client dot sign in, and we're using social sign in here. And we're going to provide a callback URL, which will be home, and a provider, which will be GitHub, all lowercase. Great. And we're going to do basically a similar thing for Google. Let me just copy that, paste it over for Google, but instead of GitHub here, I'm going to use Google instead. Then let me just make this a little bit neater. And just do click provide sign in with GitHub here, and then we can just copy this here, put this here, and instead of sign in with GitHub, we're using sign in with Google instead. Did I misspell something? Oh, uppercase I there. Let's look through and make sure that everything is in there. Make sure that you're grabbing auth client from /lib auth client, the Shadcn button, sign in with GitHub. We are providing a callback URL on a successful GitHub login. We're going to home and using the provider GitHub there, callback URL home, provider is Google for Google. In the GitHub button, we're signing in with GitHub, and with the Google button, we're signing in with Google. Great. Everything looks in order. We have our login button inside of the login page. All right. Let's navigate over to our thing here. Okay, so let's try out using GitHub first. So it'll take us to this GitHub login screen. So I'm going to log in real quick. Okay, and once we hit authorized after we logged in here, we're going to be redirected to our home page here. When we hit sign out, we get back over to the login. So now let's try Google. Okay, and when I click on Google here, I'll be prompted to sign in. So I'm going to sign in with my test account here. And once I sign in, we're going to be taken to the home screen again. Wonderful. So we can sign out, we can try it all again, GitHub, successful login, sign out, Google, successful login. Wonderful. So obviously if we try to go to the landing page here, we're going to be redirected back to home. If we sign out, we'll go back to login. If I try to go to home, I'm going to be sent back to login. So I don't know if you saw that on the top. We can try it again. Just so you can see, pay attention. See when I hit home here, I hit enter, redirects me back over to login. If I log in real quick, I'm taken to home. If I try to go to localhost 3000, just at the base level here, I hit enter, I get sent over to home. Wonderful. So we're verified that our authentication works. One thing that we can also look at is how it looks like underneath the hood. So let's take a look here. Let me just refresh the database here. Make sure that we have everything. We have the two Google and GitHub accounts here. And you might notice something here. We only have one user. So because we said that the email is unique, even though this person has used two different accounts, this person being me, they have the same email. So thus only one user is created. But we've basically linked this one user to two separate accounts, one using GitHub and one using Google. So great. Hopefully you've been able to understand how authorization works. Now we're going to continue working with our database here. How can we get some more data stored onto a server and be able to retrieve it? It's the main basis for any application. So let's dig deeper into some services that are going to help us, namely tRPC and Tanstack Query. Hopefully you agree that tRPC is a great option for when we build the API for the back end of our application. I wanted to go over a couple of concepts so that you can follow along and have a good understanding of what we're doing with tRPC. So specifically, RPCs are short for remote procedure calls. It's something that's pretty new coming about, and it's a different way of dealing with APIs. In a traditional HTTP/REST API, when we were fetching data and using AJAX, for example, a library to fetch data, you would send a request up to a server somewhere else that is exposed via a public URL, and we would wait for a specific period of time for the API to resolve our request and then give us back some form of response, which we can then parse for whatever data that we've requested, or that a mutation that we've requested to be done was completed, or some form of error state, like we were unauthorized, we weren't allowed to do it, we made an invalid request, or for some reason the server had an internal error, didn't know what was wrong, failed out. With RPC, instead of doing fetching and then parsing of the response, we're going to instead create a function that we can call and then get a response as just a return value of that function. This really helps fit the modern functional programming paradigm, where functions are first-class objects, and that we try to use code that looks like the rest of what is in our code base. So when we're working with React, a lot of things are built into either functional components or functions themselves within those functional components, and so we're just trying to make things look consistent. Okay, moving on, let's talk about some vocabulary. I want to make sure that we're all talking the same language so that when I go through and build with tRPC, you can fully understand what's going on. First off, we're going to be talking about procedures, which are functions that can serve as our API endpoints. They can be one of three things: queries, mutations, or subscriptions. For queries, we're generally hoping that it resolves to some form of return value. Think of these as your getter functions, where we're tapping into our database, we're trying to get some form of value, or we're trying to answer some form of question like, is this a valid thing? Does this user have access to this piece of data? These are generally things that can be done in queries. For mutations, we're generally looking at making some form of change. We're creating, deleting, or updating some piece of data in our database. For subscriptions, it's for real-time communication, that publisher-subscriber model, and that with a subscription, you can have kind of an open-ended API that you can query constantly and sit there and wait for data to come to you. So when we think about having a bunch of our procedures, we can organize them into routers, and just think about those as being a larger function which wraps all of our procedures together. Context, this is a very powerful part of tRPC. It allows for us to manage session state and database connections. We can initialize it from one spot and then be able to use it in all of our procedures. This really makes it easy to refactor our code if we're stripping out some form of ORM that we're using to query a database, or our database implementation itself. We can hot swap that from our init function, which we'll see later on, and don't have to go in and change every single import in all of our procedures. We just need to change it once, and the context will be able to handle those changes. Similar to that, we have middleware, which is a function that can run code before or after a procedure, and we can use that to initialize our session state, make authorization requests, and handle any frequent database queries that we might be making. And lastly, validation. So with tRPC, it being tpart being TypeScript, we have type validation. So we can very easily make sure that if we're seeking something from our procedure, we can make sure to validate it and make sure that both the input side, what we get from the user, is right, and from what we're returning. We're making sure that for our own developer sanity, we're returning the right thing as well. tRPC has a convenient section in its documentation to talk about using tRPC with Tanstack Query. So if you just go under client usage here, you'll see Tanstack React Query right on top. We can go to setup and get started. But I'm only going to be loosely following the documentation here. I personally don't think that this documentation is really that clear in how to set it up. A lot of the information's jumbled between different pages. So I'm going to go really slowly, just follow what I do, and we'll all be able to use tRPC and Tanstack Query together. To start off, we're going to have to first install the dependencies. There's no helpful copy button here, so we're going to have to select over all the dependencies that we want to install, hit Control-C to copy it. Then we can go over to our IDE, and in our terminal, paste it all in. Now, they didn't include some of the packages that even in their own documentation, they are recommending us to use. And so I'm going to install it all here instead of when we start using it, just so that we don't forget anything and run into some issues later. So first, we have Zod, then client only, server only, and lastly, super JSON. Remember that since we're using NPM, we're going to need to use --4. So let me zoom it in so that we can see everything on the same page. Why don't we push it over a little bit? There you go. So make sure that you have all of the same dependencies. NPM install tRPC server, client, Tanstack React Query belonging to tRPC, Tanstack React Query itself, Zod, client only, server only, super JSON --4. It's a lot of them, so that's why I wanted to go over it. Make sure that you have all of them, and they should install relatively easy. Great. Now let's move on to setting up the file structure for our tRPC implementation. Great. So for the file structure, we can open up source here, and at the source level, we can create a new folder called tRPC. And inside of tRPC, we're going to have the two sides of a full stack app. We're going to have client, and we're going to have server. tRPC generally doesn't deal with this client side, but this is just to delineate these are going to be used in client components. These are going to be used in server components. So I know that there's a bunch of different ways in which people kind of set up their tRPC file structure. This is the one that makes the most sense for me. You're welcome to do whatever works for you. All the files should be the same. It's just how you organize it. The imports might be a little bit different, but in modern IDEs like VS Code, all the imports should work automatically, so not too much of a worry there. So use whichever file structure feels most comfortable for you. I'm using the one that has worked out really well for me. Let's start on the server side here. We're going to create a new file, init.ts, and inside of here, we're going to start with creating our tRPC context. So we're going to create a method, create tRPC context, and it's going to use the cache from React. And although we're going to be passing into our cache is an arrow function, which will return DB, our database object from @/DB. Great. Next, we're going to have to create a type for our context, which easily enough will be DB type of DB. Right? So if you hover over a context, you can see I don't want to rewrite all of that, so I'll just use type of DB. After that, we are going to initialize our tRPC instance. So we're going to do that by init tRPC. Looks like it's not auto importing, so we're going to need to do import init tRPC from tRPC server. There we go. And then after that, we're going to need to do dot context. And we're going to pass in our context type. And then invoke the create method. And for our data transformer, we're going to use super JSON. And let's import that. So let's go and reorder things actually. straight from the top here, import super JSON from super JSON. So the primary reason for using super JSON is that when we make our API calls via tRPC and even Hano or a lot of other types of RPCs, dates become a big issue. There's random configuration errors that happen underneath the hood somehow, so that when dates get passed, they turn into strings, and if you're expecting a date object, you're going to have a mismatch. Using super JSON, you don't have that automatic conversion happen underneath the hood. You don't have to worry about that, and there are many other different cases that super JSON helps you out. So I would just recommend using it. If you're vehemently against it, then you're going to have to remember to, I'm going to call it, normalize your date objects, or normalize date strings into date objects if you use them in that manner in your code. If you're using Drizzle like I am, and you're using the types that are inherent to Drizzle, usually those types are going to be based off of date objects as opposed to date strings. And so you're going to have to be able to do those conversions. I don't want to deal with that, so I'm going to use super JSON. Next, we're going to create some base router and procedure helpers. And so we're going to first start off with create tRPC router is equal to t.router. And so that's what we'll use to create any routers that we're going to be using. You'll see what a router looks like specifically in a second. Export const create caller factory. This will allow for us to create server instances. So as you can see here, create a server-side caller for a router. Great. And you can create a base procedure here. A base procedure is one that does not use any middleware. So we can have full control over our process and not use one that has a bunch of our boilerplate in it. To show you an example of one that has this middleware, we're going to create a protected procedure which has a authorization check inherent to it. So a base procedure which you can use for any public API calls that are unauthorized. Protected procedures will only be allowed to go through for authorized users. That's just one of the use cases between having base procedures and these protected procedures. We're going to do t.procedure.use t.middleware here. And then inside of here, we're going to pass in an asynchronous function. And the reason that it's asynchronous is, if you remember, authorization was an authorization check is asynchronous. So we're going to do const session is equal to await get session from @lib auth. Then we can do the same unauthorized check. So if not session, then we're going to throw new tRPC error from @tRPC/server. So there we go. It takes in an object. We're going to provide a code here, which will be unauthorized. Great. Sorry, it's not an equal sign. It is a colon. There we go. So we can provide that error message. We're in an API, so instead of doing a redirect, we're doing a error message that we will return as a response to the user, so they can handle the error in their front end in any way that they'd like. And then we're having this little error here because we need to return next here. And then we're going to provide context. And I'd like to add in something extra, not just use the DB instance that we can use inside of our API call. We can also use user session.user, so we can provide the current user information into our context. and then we can spread the old context in. So if we had more things inside of this initial context than just DB, we'll be able to use the spread operator here to add all of them to this new context object that also includes our user. So great. When we look at this initial context type here that gets added to our initial tRPC instance, it only has this DB. We don't have access to the session until this middleware is invoked at the start of our API call. So thus, that's why we're not including this user inside of this context type. So hopefully this gives you a little impression on how some parts of tRPC works. Since we have this method create tRPC router now, let's create our app router that's going to hold all of the rest of our routes, which in turn hold all of the procedures of our application. We can start to do that by going over to server here and creating a new folder called routers. And inside of this newly created folder, we're going to add in app.ts. And inside of here, we're going to add an export const app router. And it's going to use create tRPC router from /init there. Great. And inside of here, it's going to store all of our routers. For now, we'll just pass in an empty object. Once we create our routers, we'll need to remember to add them here so that they can be used with the rest of our project. Then we're going to export type app router, which will be type of app router. So this will allow for tRPC to know what the shape of our router is, what all of the internal procedures look like. Great. Next, we're going to need to create the tRPC instance that we can actually import and use inside of our server components. We can do that by going to the server directory here and creating a new file, index.ts. When we try to use something inside of this index.ts, the file path will be trpc/server with this index.ts. It just goes back to look like server.ts. We're not going to be importing anything from init.ts outside of tRPC, so we won't have to worry about that. So that's why we can put these things in index.ts and allow for the file path to look a little bit neater in some of those imports. The first import for index.ts here will be importing server only. The reason that we're importing this is to ensure that this file cannot be imported by anything on the client. So if there's any use client on the top declaring something to be a client component, then it's going to have an error if it's importing something from this file. Next, we're going to need to import cache from React. Then we're going to import our app router from /routers/_app. So sometimes you'll see me in components turn these into @components, whatever. The reason that I do that is because if you move something, then it might re-trigger a change in your file structure, and then VS Code sometimes, or Cursor or Windsurf, sometimes does like .. to try to get to that right directory, but that looks really ugly. So that's why I use that alias @ to get around that. But I'm never really going to be moving index.ts, so I'm totally cool with this / notation. Hopefully that helps you understand why I'm allowing it this time. Next, we're going to import create tRPC context from /init. Okay, we're going to create export const get query client cache here, and we don't have this yet. We're going to create it in a second, but we're going to need to make some form of query client. This belongs to this will allow us to manage the state of the various queries that we're making and modify it. Let's say that we use a mutation and change something in our database. We would want to refresh all of our queries so that we can get all of the new data from our database and declare our old queries stale so they can get rid of the old, potentially out-of-date data. This is what the query client allows us to do. We haven't set up the client side yet, so we don't have it, but once we do, we'll go back and make sure that we have it imported. Moving on, we're going to create the exportable instance here to create tRPC options proxy. So we're not easily able to extract it. So we're going to need to import create tRPC options proxy. And this will be gotten from at tRPC/Tanstack React query. Great. And this is a method which will take in context, which will be create tRPC context, router, which will be app router, and query client, which will be get query client. Okay. Whoops, I forgot. We need to wrap these in parentheses if we're going to return it. So there's no more error here. So good. I think that we're all set with this file. Then we can move on to the client side. Make sure that we have make query client here, but also to have the same callable tRPC instance on the client side as well. Let's jump into it. For the client side, let's create that query client. So we're going to do query-client.ts. We're going to import super JSON from super JSON here. Then we're going to import a couple things from Tanstack React Query. We're going to get default should dehydrate query, and then query client. That'll be grabbed from at Tanstack React Query here. And then we're going to create a function here, const make query client, which will be an arrow function, and we'll be returning new query client. It's going to take in an object, and we're going to have a lot of pieces here, so I'm going to go a little bit slowly. Default options, we're going to dehydrate, serialized data, super JSON dot serialized. So when we look through this here, we also should have should dehydrate query, which will take in a query, and then it'll either be default should dehydrate query, passing in the query, or query.state.status is equal to pending. Great. Then we should have one for hydrate as well. Deserialize data, super JSON.deserialize. And then for our queries here, we should allow for a stall time of 30 times 1,000. Great. So that's basically 30 seconds. It's in milliseconds. So we can multiply it by 1,000. So you might be wondering what dehydrate and hydrate means in the context of why they're in our default options here. What is all this serializing? So in Tanstack Query, dehydrating means taking all of the cached query data on the client or server and turning it into a JSON object. That's where super JSON comes in. We can serialize it. Usually we send it to the client in server-side rendering. Hydration is the reverse when the client receives the data, it uses it to, quote unquote, fill in the query cache right away, so queries don't have to refetch from the server. This way, it allows for us to load in really quickly static pages and server-side rendering. And it makes it feel really instant because the data is available as soon as the page loads. Instead of having the page load, then we wait for the API call to resolve, which typically is how it works beforehand. This tries to preempt it by grabbing everything onto a cache on the server side and then retrieve it onto the client along with the data needed to load the page. So great, now that we have this make query client function, we can import it into here. Great, it's just / client query client. If you don't like that, then you can do the @/tRPC /client instead of ... here. But again, since I'm not moving these files anywhere and don't anticipate it, I'm fine with the ... notation here. Next, let's move on to creating the tRPC instance that we can use on the client side. So we're going to call create index.tsx. We're going to have some JSX in here, so that's why we have this be a .tsx file. So make sure you're going to have a bunch of errors if you don't make this a tsx file. So I'm just going to make special emphasis on that. This will be on the client, so we're going to have use client along the top. We're going to create a singleton instance of our client query client. Singleton. We're going to make sure that it's of type query client, taken from @Tanstack React query. We're going to create a function get query client that we're going to use in our client components. If we're on the server, type of window is equal to undefined. Basically, so we're calling from a server component, make a new query client. So we're going to call return make query client here. And then if we're in a regular client component, since we need to make sure as a singleton and how the singleton pattern works, we need to make sure that there's only one instance. So we'll have client query client singleton and this nullish assignment operator, where basically how it works is it checks to see if client query client singleton, as we've created it here, is of either two types, null or undefined. If it is of either of those types, it performs an assignment. If it's not, then it ignores this assignment. So when we first initially create client query client singleton, it is of type undefined because it doesn't exist. We haven't assigned it a value yet. So thus, when we go through and if we call get query client, if we're in this initial state and it hasn't been created yet, then it's going to be of defined. It's going to do this assignment. What are we assigning it to? Make query client. So this ensures that we're following the singleton design pattern, that only one instance of an object exists. So if this exists, then this assignment doesn't happen. We're not calling make query client, and we're not assigning client query client singleton to the value of this. Don't blame me for the complicated name of this variable that was in the source code in the documentation. Maybe we can call it client side query client. I mean, this is already query client. I don't know how to really impress upon it that it's client side. It doesn't really matter. We don't use it anywhere other than here. So, who cares? In the long run, what it's super named, we're mostly going to be using this get query client function. Next, we'll be creating a function that will get the URL that this project will be deployed on. So For this tutorial specifically, we're going to be deploying on Vercel, spoiler alert. So if you want to deploy on Vercel, just like me, and follow this tutorial, do what I'm doing. If you're deploying on a different provider, then you're going to need to figure out how to deal with the URL on your respective provider. But I'm going to be focusing on Vercel here. So we're going to have type of window not equal to undefined. So this is basically the opposite of the above here. So if we're calling it in this check, right, if it's the opposite of this, we're calling it from a client component, then this is not going to work. And we need to make sure if process.environment.vercel underscore URL, make sure that you write it exactly this way. We don't have to add this to environment variables. These environment variables are part of Vercel itself. So if you're using Vercel, then you don't have to worry about this. It's just the way to do it. Return https:// So this is how we add in a variable into a string. Process.environment.vercel underscore URL. And then if there's none of these, then return, we're on development, http:// localhost 3000. Great. Then we need to call this arrow function that we've created here. So the base evaluates to a string value, either empty string, your Vercel URL, or localhost 3000. And then we're going to return one of those three values, base API/tRPC. So basically we've created the base of the URL here, empty string if we're on the client, the Vercel URL if you're using Vercel, or localhost 3000. If it's not either of these, then we're in development, and we're returning that and specifying the API route that we're providing. So, great. Now that we have both of those functions, we can create a tRPC provider. So tRPC React provider. It's going to take in props, read only, children of type React node. I saw something import there. Let me make sure that it's the right thing. Yep. React from React. Let me change these, or clean up the imports so they're in ABC order. Great. Now that we have both of these functions, we can create a provider for us to use with tRPC. So we're going to have tRPC React provider. Arrow function. It's going to have props, read only, children, type React node. Great. Wait, this goes here. There we go. Arrow function here. And we are going to be grabbing our query client using get query client. Then creating a tRPC client here using use state, also from React. And in this state, we're going to be returning create tRPC client here, grabbed from @tRPC/client. So make sure it's not @/tRPC client. We're not grabbing it, obviously, from this own file, but we're grabbing it from the package itself. So we'll just move those around a little bit. And then it will have of type app router. So we need that. Grab it from our server/routers underscore app.ts here. Let's close that. then provide an object to this function. We'll have links, and links will be HTTP batch link taken from tRPC client as well. This is a function that we'll call and provide in a transformer, which will be super JSON. That does not, nope. We want all lowercase one, so let's just go up to the top here, import super JSON from super JSON. Great. And then for the URL, we're going to call get URL. Awesome. Just make sure we provide all the things that we need here. Oh, that's semicolon. Then we're going to return query client provider taken from at Tanstack React query here. It takes in a prop client, which will be our query client here. Then we need to provide in tRPC provider. And for us to get this tRPC provider, we're just going to scroll up to the top here. We're going to need to extract it, const tRPC provider. Also use tRPC here from create tRPC context from at tRPC Tanstack React query. Great. We're going to pass in our app router and then invoke that function. We're going to bring this up to the top here. O after L. There we go. Great. And tRPC provider takes in a tRPC client, which will be tRPC client that we created right here. And it needs a query client, which will be query client. And then we will provide props.children. Wonderful. So I caught a little thing here. So we are importing the full query client here, but we're really just using it as a type. So it's more of an efficiency thing in bundling size. It's not too big of a deal since this isn't used more than once. It's literally actually only being used once here with the singleton. But really, if we're being super tough on ourselves, then it should be of type query client. So if we're using something as a type, we'll grab it here like that. So this will only be used as a type in the bundle. As you can see, they're both essentially equivalent, but you know, in the final bundling, this is a little bit more efficient. So all in all, we have our two functions here, which we use inside of our provider. Now we're going to have to create the provider and wrap our application inside of it. Last thing before we finish up with our setup is creating the overall providers at the app level that will hold our tRPC and Tanstack Query providers that we've created here. What we're going to do is just close everything down so that we can kind of clean things up, make sure that we can figure out where the right spot to put things are. At the source directory level, which, you know, if we just open this up, right click on this, and add in a providers directory here, we can create an index.tsx file. Our provider will be a client component, so we need to add in use client on the top here. We're going to provide an interface so we can provide some props for our provider. And so it will just be children, react.react node here. Export const provider is equal to, we're just going to extract children from our provider props here. Great. And then we're going to create a quick state here is mounted. Set is mounted. That will be use state grabbed from React, and the initial value will be false. We're going to use a use effect here. We're going to set is mounted to be true inside of this use effect. We're going to have its dependency array be empty. If not is mounted, return null. Otherwise, we're going to return our tRPC React provider here, and then wrap our children inside of it. Great. So what's going on here? Why am I doing all this stuff and having to put our tRPC React provider inside of another provider? So one of the things that I'm trying to avoid here is something that is unique to server-side rendering. This didn't used to exist in base React, but as we started doing more things on the server side, we had to make sure that things on the server match what is on the client. So what I'm doing here is to check when the provider, which we've said is a client component, we've declared it to be so on the top here with use client. Once it mounts via this use effect, we want to set use is mounted to be true, thus triggering a re-render. Because initially, when we go through and this component is evaluated, the state is currently false. We're not mounted. So if we're not mounted, then we return null. We don't do anything at all. In this way, it's because we're going to be doing API calls. And before the API call has come in, we don't want to render anything because some things might rely on the data that we're pulling in. So until we get that data and until the provider and the tRPC provider is mounted, we don't want to render anything else. Once we actually have a proper mounting of our provider, the tRPC instance that we created inside of our init file here is initialized, then we can start to render our children. So that's the goal of this file. We're not only making this provider just for tRPC. Later on, when we add modals, we're going to be putting them inside of our provider too. Generally, modals require some form of data that may exist on the server, but haven't been given on the client yet, or haven't been retrieved on the client yet. And so they'll have incomplete data. And when we render our modals, we're going to have some issues if the state isn't initialized. Data values don't exist. They're undefined. Those modals are going to hit errors because certain fields in past props don't exist yet because they haven't been retrieved from an API, for example. So this is why we're building this providers. We're going to be using it a lot later on. The last step before we finish up with our providers is to actually use it within our application. The place to put it is at the topmost level, and that would be our app directory level, root directory level layout. So when we go into our layout here, we have this children already wrapped within braces. We're just going to provide our provider here and make sure that you grab it from /providers, not the Radix UI one. We're going to grab that there, put it in, make sure that we put our children in there, and success. We've successfully put our providers at the top level of our application, which now allows us to use tRPC and Tanstack within our application. So cool. Now that we have that, let's move on to creating a demo to showcase the power and the ease of use of a modern API. The first step in our demo is to create an extra table in our schema. And I'm just going to zoom out real quick What we're going to do is just create an extra table, const, and the demo that I decided to go with is just a incrementer and decrementer. So in this PG table, we're going to call it count. And inside of this count, we're going to have an ID, text, ID, primary key, as every table should have. Then we're going to have the actual count, which will be of type integer. Make sure that you grab that from PG core. And we're going to call this one count, not null. Require it to have some form of a value. And then we're going to have user ID. So to connect this count to a particular user, we can just copy this from what we had before. This part here, go back down. Text of user ID, not null, references to the user table's ID value here. And when we delete the user from our database, then it's going to cascade and then also delete this count. Great. Once we've locked in our schema, now we can do npx drizzle kit generate. Then after that, we can do npx drizzle kit push to send in our updates. Our changes have been applied. We're all set there. We can switch over to our Neon console, hit refresh real quick, and see that our count table has been added with all of the columns that we have identified: ID, count, and user ID. Great. We can now move on to creating a router that will hold all the procedures and allow for us to create a count object. Entry, we can delete it, we can update it by incrementing or decrementing the integer value in the count column. All of that stuff we can do within procedures. So switching back over to the code, we can start the work on our router by going into our tRPC folder, then to servers, then to routers, and creating a new file here, count.ts. Now what we're going to do is use some of the same code that we used over here in the app router. So we're just going to copy this bit here and then paste it into our count. We're going to rename app router to count router. So now we have the basis for our router. First procedure we're going to make is the create count procedure. And we've got to look at our index.ts to make a choice about which procedure we're going to use. We have two of them that we've created here: a base procedure that we can use for unauthorized users, and a protected procedure, which we have an authorization check here. When we create a procedure, we have a decision to make. Do we make it a base procedure or do we make it a protected procedure? Does authorization matter to us? Do we want someone to be a user before they can create an account, for instance? Or can everyone do it? That's the decision we're going to have to make whenever we create one of our procedures. So back over to count. When we look at create count, since count requires, if we look at our schema, a user ID, then we need for someone to be authenticated. That way we can then get a user ID from them and apply it to the count entry that we create. So going back to the count here, we've got to use the protected procedure. In this case, since we're making a modification to the database by adding a new entry to a table, this will be a mutation. In our mutation here, we're going to return an asynchronous function. And as a parameter, we're going to have context. We're going to provide to our mutation an asynchronous function, which has one parameter, our context. And let's plan out what goes inside of our procedure here. For our first step, we should check if a count already exists for our user. I think that it would be best to have, just for the sake of this demo and for the sake of simplicity, one count per user. So if a count already exists, then we shouldn't allow the user to create another count. So check if a count exists for the current user. Great. Then if one exists, throw an error. If it doesn't, then create one. So we have our if condition and then our else condition here. So we've got 3 steps. Let's implement it. So to check if a count exists, we're going to do const existing count is equal to await context.db.query, querying count, the count table. We're going to find the first one, where we're going to use a function taken from Drizzle ORM equal. So if count, which we're going to grab from @/db schema, this one here, dot user ID matches, and since we in our protected procedure here return an instance of the user here, context.user.id. So we're going to go through all the tables, and for the first one that we find where there's a match between a user ID and the current user that signed in's ID, then we're going to grab that and put it inside of this existing count variable. Then we're going to do this if condition, if existing count. Then we're going to throw new tRPC error. And tRPC error takes in a code, which we can choose one. I think the one that probably matches is internal server error message. We can elaborate on this and say count already exists for current user. Great. And then if it doesn't, then create one. So what we're going to do is just actually let it fall through. So with this throwing, then it's not going to go through to the next part. So this is in the existing count does not exist world. Then we're going to await ctx.db.insert count. And we're going to pass in to our values here a couple of things. But first thing, for our ID, we're going to need some form of identifier to add in here. Unique identifier. So we can have many options. I think the one that I'm going to use is UUID. It's the simplest one to install. So npm I UUID -- force. So I know there are many different unique IDs that people want to use. Nano ID is another one. People have been talking about a lot of the different ones in the discourse. If you want to use a different identifier, it's totally fine. They should all work the same. So I'm going to do UUID here and install it. Then next, I usually like to create a little helper export for me. So the export for UUID isn't very clean. So what I'm going to do here is import v4 as UUID from UUID. So usually you'd have to import that every single time along the top. There's not a clean import. So we're going to do export UUID here. And so that makes a clean export for us. So in this ID here, if I just need my UUID, I can choose @/lib UUID right here and have a clean import. So let's just clean up some of our different imports here, separate them out. Great. Cool. So we have UUID, then we have count, which if we're creating the first one, we can either start it at 0 or 1. I'll just start it at 1. And for the user ID, we're going to provide ctx.user.id. And UUID needs to be a function call. Great. So that's basically our create count here. We go through and we check to see if a count exists for the current user. If one already exists, then we throw an error. If it doesn't exist, then we just create one. Wonderful. Moving on to the next one, we're just going to go in ABC order through our CRUD operations here. We're going to delete next, and deleting a count probably should be a protected procedure. We don't want anybody unauthorized deleting someone else's count. So it makes sense for it to also be a protected procedure. Mutation, async, just like the top one there, provide our context value here. So let's plan out this procedure here. First, check if a count exists for the current user, right? So we can do the exact same thing as we have up here. So that's already step one. The opposite of this one, so if one doesn't exist, then we throw an error. So all we need to do for this one is if not existing count, throw new error, and then just say no count exists for this user, so nothing to delete. And then if we fall through, that means a count does exist, so we're going to await ctx.db.delete count where equals count.user ID context.user.id. So we're deleting the count that has a user ID that belongs to the user that's being authorized here. Great. Moving on to the next one. We'll do our getter procedure next. So just for the sake of this tutorial, I mean, you probably don't want a unauthorized user to get someone else's count, but just for the sake of being able to demo a few things, I'll just make it public. So get count, and this will be a base procedure instead. And this is going to be a query here. So query is going to take in an async function, just like our mutation here. We're going to provide our context and then do some things. But first, when we're getting our count here, well, since we don't have access to this user, then like in our protected procedure, that we need to have some way of indicating which count we want. So usually, since in this protected procedure we have a user and we have a user ID, we can just find any count based off of the user ID. But in this case, since we don't have any user IDs, then we're going to need some way to search for a count that we want. So one of the ways that we can do that is to provide an input here. And before, you might have remembered that we installed Zod. So this would be the place for us to provide a schema for our input. So it's not the same schema that we provided here in schema.ts. We're providing a schema of what a user needs to input to this get count procedure in order to get a proper query. So we're going to do Z to grab from Zod, object, and then we need to specify our input here. And in this case, we're just going to look for count ID, which will be of type z.string. And you can provide some additional information here. You know, if it's an optional value, which this is not, but just in case, you know, in the future you might need it. You have optional, you have min for minimum length, you have max length, you have many ways to modify. It's one of the powers of Zod. You can create these structured types to force the user to provide inputs that you want to your API. Otherwise, it's going to error out. So in this case, we just need the z.string. Unlike in schema, where not null is to specify that something's not optional, in Zod instead, if something's optional, you just say that it's optional. Otherwise, if you don't say anything, then it's going to be counted as required. So now that we have an input here, alongside our context value, we're also going to grab input, which is just an object that has our schema here. So let's plan what goes inside of this procedure. First, we just perform the query. So in this case, query the database to find the count which has the same count ID. If a count with that ID exists, return it. And if no count exists, we're going to put this before the return here. If no count exists, then throw in error. Okay, so let's grab the count first. So existing count. We're going to do a similar thing to this. So let's grab that. But instead of the user ID, because that does not exist, we're going to grab, and you can do this in two ways. One is you can extract it out by getting count ID from input here, and then using count ID here, right? And then this would be ID. And that's how you would search it. Or you could remove that and do input dot count ID. Both are equivalent. One has an extra statement that you have to write. When inputs get a little bit wild, sometimes you might want to extract all of them, but it's up to you. Personal preference. Either one works. I'll just leave it this particular way. So next, we're going to do if not existing count, throw new error, and, whoops, tRPC error. And let's see if we have one. No count exists. Yeah, so probably something like this. So I'll just grab parts of this. No count exists for the specified, or yeah, the specified count ID. And then if a count does exist, then return existing count. Great. So initially, you have count being either our count object that corresponds with the type that we created in our schema, or undefined. It could not exist. By doing this check here, throwing an error if one does not exist, and when existing count is undefined, then when we return it here, we are assured that existing count is an object. Great. Our last procedure is to update our count. Now there's technically two different updates. I'll just call it update count here, just so that we don't have two different procedures for incrementing and decrementing. But in order to control incrementing and decrementing, what I'm going to do is have an input here, z.object, and a user can pass in is increasing, and that will be a boolean, z.boolean. Great. And since it's a protected procedure, we're going to be grabbing it from user ID, so we don't need to provide a count ID. Great. Then after this input, we're going to do mutation. We're going to provide our asynchronous function here. Grab our context and our input. And arrow function. There we go. Let's plan out this procedure here. So let's just look at some of the ones that are back. So we can do the same check if a count exists for the current user. That makes sense. If it does not exist, then we throw an error. And instead of saying delete here, there's nothing to update. Then, if one does exist, we need to increment or decrement depending on the is increasing value. Where if is in. To do this, we're going to have to do await context.db.update count set, and we're going to provide only the value that we need to have changed, which is count. And based off of the is increasing variable here, we're going to do existing count dot count plus 1 or existing count dot count minus 1. So hopefully that's easy enough. And we need to tell it which count to do. So where equals count dot user ID context dot user dot ID. Wonderful. So going through this again, we check to see if a count exists for the current user. If it doesn't exist, we throw an error. If it does exist, then we increment or decrement based off of the user passing in a Boolean value, true or false, to is increasing. Wonderful. Before we move on and start implementing our demo of tRPC and Tanstack React Query and test to make sure that our newly written procedures work, I wanted to have a brief discussion about prefetching and why it matters. I think that a lot of new developers have a poor understanding about how fetching and prefetching work. So I created this chart here to go over all of the different pieces here. Prefetching is all about speeding up the user experience by loading data before a component actually needs it. Instead of waiting for the client to fetch data after the page loads, we quote-unquote warm up the cache on the server and hydrate it into the browser. So hopefully making our apps feel instant and responsive in terms of loading time. Here's how it works on the server side. First, we call query client prefetch query. This runs the query ahead of time during the server render phase and stores the result in Tanstack React Queries cache. Next, we call dehydrate query client. This takes all of our cached data and converts it into a plain JSON object. This is important because we can't send JavaScript functions over the wire. We can only send data. So finally then, we pass that serialized cache into a hydration boundary. This is provided by Tanstack. This wraps our component tree and embeds the cache right into the HTML that gets sent over to the browser. Once the page hits the browser, React starts up and hydration kicks in. The hydration boundary component runs internally and calls hydrate from Tanstack React Query. This restores the cache using the data embedded in the HTML. Now, when our client component mounts and run use query, React Query checks the cache using the query key. Depending on the result, if it finds a match, a cache hit as it's called, then it instantly serves that data to our UI. That means there's no loading needed and there's no additional network requests. But if the data is not in the cache or the data is considered stale, it falls back to fetching from the network like usual. So those are the steps towards prefetching. We're just trying to optimize the load times as much as possible by front loading it on the server side so that when the user tries to navigate between different pages in the app, each navigation and each time a component needs to mount, we don't trigger an API call as well, which can take a certain period of time that lengthens the loading state that we have the user wait through upon each navigation. So hopefully you agree that prefetching makes sense. Let's jump over to the code and actually start implementing it. Okay, we're back here in the code. Let me just close everything and clean everything up. So what I'm going to be really focusing on is all the stuff in app directory. We have this landing page. We have this home page. And the first thing we're going to do is, thinking back to what I was talking about, we need a separation between the client and server. So we're going to have the landing page in page.tsx be on the server side. It's already asynchronous. We can make a separation between all of our JSX here, stick it over on the client side, put all of our JSX, which will render a lot of our query data that we will be prefetching. So by default, if we don't specify use client on the top, then the component is considered a server component by default. So this will be the server side. We're going to create a client side component, which will hold most of our JSX, if not all of it. And the reason for that is when we query the data, a lot of it gets rendered in the UI. So it makes sense to just pair our queries with our JSX. Also, if we're making any mutations, any modifications to data in our database, they'll usually be triggered by a UI element. And so it just makes sense to package our queries and mutations that are being executed with our JSX, and then have our server component here deal with authentication, which occurs asynchronously, and prefetching, since it needs to occur on the server. So let's get started. What I'm going to create is for at the app level, because it's at the level of our landing page here, a hidden route here, hidden folder, underscore UI. So by doing underscore UI, UI is not going to be included in the routing tree. So you can't go to underscore UI because it has that underscore. And we're going to do the same thing in home. Just add underscore UI here. And my naming convention for the client-side component, I usually just call it whatever the name of the page is, plus contents. So we're just going to add in here, use client right on the top here, export const landing page contents. So since this is an exported component, it doesn't need to be export default like pages are. Let me just grab this JSX here and paste it into here. We'll need to grab the imports as well. So let me just stick that there. Grab this, put this here. Great. And so let me add return landing page contents to our landing page. Then we're going to do the same thing for our home. So we're going to add in home page contents.tsx, export const home page contents, and need to remember to add use client to the top. Use client. Great. And then from our home here, we're just going to grab all the things, all the things that are being rendered there. And we'll need the import for our sign out button. Tremendous. Great. Oh, wait, whoops. We need to grab our home page contents. Wonderful. Great. So everything in the functionality is just the same. We've just separated out all the things that need to occur on the server or on the home page component itself. Anything that needs to happen on the client will do in the home page contents component. So what I'm going to do is just move these over corresponding with their individual page. Right, so home page with home page, landing page with landing page. We're going to do the prefetching on this side, and then doing the actual queries and eventually mutations on the other side. And you can't prefetch a mutation. I hope that's also clear. Obviously, mutations occur when you have some form of data to mutate, and obviously you don't know that ahead of time, and so you generally don't prefetch those. So prefetching only for queries. Mutations, they happen when the user asks for it. We can't really optimize loading there in the same manner. So there's going to be a lot of stuff to do with prefetching, but one of the first things is I'm just going to install a quick package. It's called React Error Boundary. So when we throw our tRPC errors, we need a boundary like we do with hydration to basically catch things. And in this case, with the error boundary, obviously it's for catching any errors that occur when we're doing our fetches. So we can create some form of an error state or a piece of UI that shows an error state that we can then use as a fallback. Something that's like refresh the page to try again, or automatically, hit this button to navigate to a different page. I'm going to do this. Remember to do -- force. Grab that. And we're going to do const query client is equal to get query client from @/trpc/server. Great. Void. So this is a little bit of funky syntax, but this is the way that it's done. Void query client dot prefetch query. And inside of here, we're going to use tRPC, grabbed from the server. Then dot count, which, if you guys remember from our routers here, we have all of our procedures. We put them inside of the app router, and our key to call reference it is count. So here, tRPC.count, and here you can see we have our create count, delete count, get count, and update count. So in this landing page, we're going to do get count, and sorry, it's dot query options. And query options we need to provide, if you remember, it requires an input of count ID. Now here initially, we don't know what our count ID is, so we're just going to add in a empty string for now. Later on, when we create a count in the future, I'm going to cheat and go into the database and grab it. I think it's unfortunate in the way that we, I hope you don't mind, it's just for the demo's sake. We'll just grab it that way, but usually you'll have some way of referencing the count ID. So probably usually in the URL parameters, you'd have it. But for the sake of this demo, we'll just hard code it in there. So let's just move this around here real quick. We have our count here. We prefetched it. Now we need to set up all of our boundaries. So what we're going to do is add some parentheses around this, pop it down, and tab this over just for styling's sake. And we're going to have our hydration boundary, which is grabbed from @Tanstack React Query here. Make sure that we put our landing page contents in here. We're also going to have error boundary, not taken from that, taken from what we just did our installation on. So it's going to be the top one, import error boundary from React error boundary. There we go. So we have boundary here, and we're going to have a requirement here, but for now, let's just not worry about that for just 1 second while we get everything else. We're going to need a suspense to deal with the loading state. Even though we're trying to minimize it, there's still going to be a loading state, so we're going to have suspense to handle that. And then tab this over. Great. So those are the main three parts that we need: a hydration boundary, an error boundary, and a loading boundary, if you want to think about it in that way. The initial state here for the hydration boundary will be dehydrate. So use that function there from @Tanstack. And then pass in our query client. Great. So let me just move some of these things around real quick. And then basically what we're going to have is two fallbacks here. So we can just do, for the sake of this, two divs. And this one will be, there was an error here. And then this can also be a fallback. And another div, loading. So we'll see that later on when we showcase a loading state, and hopefully there's no error. Maybe I'll induce an error just to see what the error state looks like. It'll just be there was an error appearing on the screen, so nothing too riveting. And then we have our internal component tree here, all of the pieces of the landing page. So let's get through and implement the query side and then do a quick render over here of the count. So over here on the client side, we're going to have const tRPC. Unlike on the server here, where we can just import tRPC directly, we have a function, a hook, that allows for us to use the client-side tRPC instance. So here we're just calling use tRPC, taken from the client side, to get our tRPC object here. Then the typical query looks like this. Const data is equal to use, and since we have a suspense here with a loading state, use suspense query here from @Tanstack React Query. And what we're going to pass in is our tRPC object here, dot count, dot get count dot query options. So, and query options is a function, and we'll need to provide count ID. And for now, we'll just do empty string. We'll hard code it in later, as I've been explaining. But here, if you hover over data, you can see we have the shape of what we expect from a count object that we've stored in the database, the actual count itself, the user ID, and the ID that corresponds to each count. So what we're going to just do is add in some divs here underneath this one, and we'll write count will be data dot count there. And what else do we want to display? Maybe just for the sake of demonstration here, data.id. Sure. And maybe also just we'll display it all. User ID. Great. So that's basically all you have to do to just grab it. We prefetched it, got everything on the server. If the query key here is the same as we put here, then we'll just use that data that we prefetched. If it's something different, then we'll need to make another API call in order to get the new data. Or if the data that we've prefetched here extends beyond, and I believe it is not in init, it is, where is it? I think it's on the client side. Let's see here. Yes, the stale time here, if it exceeds 30,000 milliseconds, I believe, then it will just refetch, sorry. So great, let's do the same thing for the home page real quick. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the home page is going to take care of all of the authorized features. We're probably just going to do the same query here, so we're going to just copy it. And since mutations don't need to be prefetched, it'll basically look the same. So what we can do is just copy a lot of this over, and I'll just do, I think, this. Yep. And I get it. A lot of errors, a lot of scary errors. What we're going to do is just also get rid of this and push this here, rid of the semicolon. And then we need our imports. So let's see here. We can just copy all of these and then paste it in here, and we should be fine. Great. And then for the home page, we can just grab all of these here, paste them in at the top, grab the imports, paste them in over here as well. Great. And we're not using the data yet. We'll probably just have a little thing here that displays the count. So we'll do the same thing here, but we won't need to display the rest. But I'll just create a quick row of buttons. So class name, flex, row, gap, x of 2, let's just say. We can deal with the styling later when we render everything. And then we're just going to have a few buttons. So we're going to have a button. This one will be increment. And this one will be decrement. Or I can just say decrease and increase. Right? And then button here for delete. And I'll just add in a little icon for a trash icon there. Great. And let's see. I think we should figure out a way to handle how we're going to deal with if a count does not exist. So I believe how we're actually doing it in our router now is, whoops, it opened over here. If we get the count, if there is no existing count, then it's going to throw an error, which is probably not what we want to have happen now that I'm thinking about it. So we're going to make just a quick modification here. So we're not going to throw an error. when there's no count. And if existing count is potentially undefined, then we need to make sure that we just provide some indication that it is so without impacting all the other stuff. So we can do ID is undefined as well, and user ID undefined. So everything is undefined. Within here, we're just providing that the entire query can't return an undefined object. Here, we're making sure that we're providing some form of object. Great. So what we're going to do is render something different. So in this case here, for this bit, we're just going to add in a quick conditional here. If data.count exists, then we'll render all of this. This all needs one parent, so we'll just add a fragment here. There we go. And then for the other side here, we'll add in a div here that just says no count exists. Great. And then for the home contents here, obviously this count does not exist, so we are going to wrap it in pretty much the same thing here. So we'll just add this here, hit enter, move all this stuff over, add another parentheses, and then we'll fill this out a little bit later. Let me add in the fragment and move all this stuff up. If you're wondering how I'm moving all of this stuff up, if you have something highlighted and you hit Alt on your keyboard or Command, and you hit the arrow keys up and down, you can basically move them. So that's how I was moving this stuff up and down, if you're curious. And we need to open or close the braces here. And then here we're just going to add in a button that says create first count, or just create count, since there aren't going to be multiple. Great. So we're going to need to create our mutations, and then we'll add them to each of our buttons. What we're going to do for each mutation is const create count, and we'll use mutation taken from @Tanstack here, and we're going to provide in our tRPC dot count dot create count and provide mutation options. And mutation options gives us an opportunity to deal with what happens on error. So if there was an error while we were performing some form of mutation. And for now, we'll just do an empty function. We'll deal with that functionality a little bit later. And then here we'll have on success. And that'll also be an empty function. Let me just deal with creating all of the mutations first, and then we'll deal with the mutation options in a second. The next one, const delete count, use mutation, tRPC.count.create, delete count, mutation options. Great. And finally, const update count, use mutation tRPC.count.update count.mutation options. Whoops. Add an extra P there. And then all I'm going to do is just copy this part here so that they all have on success and on error. And what I'm going to do is just provide a toast message. So it's a little pop-up that will appear on the corner, and it'll explain what just happened for the user to see. So first, we're going to have error be the title, and then inside of there, we're going to have close button to be true, so we can close the toaster. And then description here, an error occurred while creating the count. Great. Whoops. And then we're going to do the same for the others. So let me just copy this, stick this here, stick this also here. And toast I got from Sonar, just so that everyone's clear about that. which was part of the Shadcn installations that we had. Sonar, and I believe, Toast is not a part of it anymore, so we only have Sonar right here. Cool. So we'll need another Toast for success here. Or actually, we don't need a Toast. So if we create a count, the UI is going to be updated, so we don't need a little pop-up in the corner that says a count has been created, because obviously the user will see the feedback that the UI changes. What we are going to need to do is get query client. So real quick, we're going to do const query client is equal to use query client, taken again from Tanstack here. And we're going to say in this query client, invalidate query. So we're basically saying for query key tRPC dot count dot get count, we're basically saying that this query is now stale. You need to refetch it. So that's what this chunk does here. And let me actually just make it bigger so that you can see as much of it as possible here. And then we're going to do something similar for the other on successes. Actually, the exact same for all of them. So we can just do this, actually. We don't need the curly braces. Great. And for each of the error while deleting the count and while updating the count. Wonderful. So we need to attach our mutations now to our buttons. So what we're going to do is for create count here, I'm just going to do on click here to call create count dot mutate. Whoops, not mutate async. You could choose mutate async. I'm just going to call the regular mutation. Great. So that's for the create count. Then we have another one for delete. So on click here, which will be delete count dot mutate. And does this mutation take anything? Let me check in the count real quick. Delete count does not need an input. Only update count does. And so what we're going to do here for the increment, increase and decrease here, all that we're going to do is on click update count dot mutate here. We need to provide is increasing to be true. And then we'll do the same for decrease here. Is increasing to be false. Wonderful. So hopefully you'll understand that we're doing what we're doing for each one of these. So we have an increase button, we have a decrease button. It will be increasing the count when we hit the increase button, and we'll be decreasing when we hit the decrease button. And so we provide toasts on the error because usually there is no UI indication that an error has occurred. So we need to explicitly tell the user. That's good design pattern there. On success, we need to invalidate the query that occurs both in the home page but also on the landing page. So if we were to navigate between them, we would see a change happening because we've invalidated that query and it needs to refresh. So it'll get the new value. Great. So looks like we have everything done. So we're going to do npm run dev to get it started on the server. So transitioning over to the browser real quick. Let's just do a quick refresh. And great. So this is the landing page. No count exists. You can see there a very brief loading that popped in that occurs sometimes. Again, remember, unless the data is stale and if there's a change in count ID, then there is no refetch that's needed. And so it's only after we waited a certain period of time that the loading resumes. So now let me just log in. We can head over to look at the home page. Okay, after signing in, we are now back here on the home page. And great, we have a create count button. So Let's try it out. We can hit create count, and let's look at our server here. We seem to have a code of 200, which means that it worked. So we can go into our Neon console, hit refresh real quick, and we can see that a count has been successfully created. Great. So the reason that this UI doesn't update just yet is because we don't actually have a count value to put in our query options here. So there's a couple ways that we can remedy this. We can obviously just copy this and put it inside of count here, right? And if we hit save here, we go back and refresh, then we get our little panel here that corresponds to in our code is now showing because count is a valid number, 1. As we've seen, if we go over to our Neon database real quick, a count of 1. I think that we should actually change this so that it's explicitly not undefined, because if count gets decremented to 0, then this conditional would be false and thus would fall through to prompting the user to create another count. That's definitely not what we want. So just saying explicitly that count is not undefined, then we're going to show the little panel here. Great. So we can try to increase, decrease. Those look to be all good. And if we delete, we'll be prompted to create another count. We have to go back into our database, grab the new ID of the count that we just created so that we can stick it back into the home here. There could be some elegant ways to fix this. One of which would be, if I just paste this correctly here, if we just refresh, count of 1, let me just increase it to 3 real quick. If we put this ID into our landing page contents here, in this count ID, if we sign out, and go back to the landing page, then we should see count being 3. This was the ID that we provided, and this is the user ID. So, showing that get count as it was a base procedure. If we go back to the code real quick and just open up our count.ts here, it's a base procedure, which means that there is no auth check like a protected procedure. Then it can still be viewed within the landing page. So switching back to the website real quick, yeah, you can see that everything is working now. I'm sure that there is more elegant ways to deal with grabbing this ID. I just wanted to showcase in the demo that everything is working. I'm sure that you can provide parameters in the URL up here, this ID, then extract the parameters here. Const params is equal to use params, right? To then pull the ID, count ID from the parameters and do the query that way. So, but just for demo's sake, I just wanted to show that the API is working. We're able to modify data that is stored within our Neon database and be able to modify it when we log in. So we can increase it, decrease it, and delete it, which if we go back to our Neon database, we can see it's an empty count table. Awesome. Hopefully you understand now how to use tRPC, Tanstack. It was a really long tutorial, but I hope that it was well worth it. Let's move on to the next step. So what we're going to do now is remove all references to count from our project and try to create a clean starting point to our tutorial that we can then push up onto GitHub. The goal of this is to have a starting point that you can reuse in the future when we work on other tutorials. As well as if you make a mistake during this tutorial, you'll be able to fall back and, clone. You'll be able to clone the starting point and be able to have a fresh start. So let's jump right into cleaning up some of our files here. Okay, starting from the landing page here, what we're going to remove is everything but this is the landing page and the login button. We can remove this stuff here. remove these imports. So that'll be it for the landing page contents. Then for the home page contents here, we've got a lot to get rid of. So we'll start from the sign out button here. We'll just highlight everything up until this is the home page, and we will remove that. We will remove all of our mutations here, and let's make sure that we remove all of the corresponding imports. So that's all that the homepage contents needs to look like. Great. Next up, we can probably go to our schema and remove count. That'll cause a lot of issues. We can delete this counts.ts. We don't need this anymore. Remove that. Let's look for count in our project and see where we have left over. Oh, we have them in our pages. So in our home page, we can remove this. And honestly, we can keep the rest. We don't need this just yet. For the landing page, don't know if you're really going to be doing a lot of API calls in the landing page. So we'll probably just remove everything. I don't think that you'll necessarily need it. You know what? I'm just going to leave it just in case. There's no problem with leaving it. Great. So that's all you need to remove from the landing page there. Let's go back to the search and see if there's any other counts. Everything looks to be an account or was in what's needed to update the database. So I can say that you can either go into your project here in Neon and just drop the table. You can delete this whole project and just create a whole new one for our starting point. Or you can go in and do npx drizzle kit generate. Then after generating, we can do npx drizzle kit push. So great, our changes have been applied. So let's jump real quick over to Neon here. And take note that there's no more count table. Wonderful. All right, after we're done with all the database stuff, one of the last things that we can do before we finish our starting point here is to remove all of these files from public. We don't really use them throughout our project, so we don't need them. We'll be adding a lot of our own images to the public folder anyways, so don't have to worry about these. So make sure that you delete all of them. Now, what we're going to do is just run npm run build real quick. And, you know, it might take a little bit, but ultimately, let's just see if there are anything that we've forgotten to do. Okay, so in schema.ts, integer is not being used anywhere. I wonder if I only used it for the count. So we can just get rid of that. So make sure that you remove that. Let's run npm run build one more time. We're just looking for any of these little failure to compile issues, just so that when we download the starting point, we can just do npm run dev and make sure that everything's working, no issues in the compilation. So looks like we're all done past the compiling step. Yep, so we're all good. Now we can move on to pushing it to GitHub. Now we can move on to pushing this repo onto GitHub. Great. I'm here in my personal GitHub account. I'm just going to create a new repository here. I'm going to call it tutorial starting point. And I'm going to make this public for anybody to take a look at. For viewers to have a common starting point to use with my tutorials. Great. So we're going to create this repository. And then now we have the URL for it. We're just going to copy this real quick. We're going to go back to our code here. We're going to do git add dot git commit first commit. And these are the steps to push our code up to GitHub. Git remote add origin and paste in that URL that you grabbed from the GitHub page here. Great. Git branch -m master. So now we've in the master branch. Git push origin master. And if we go back to GitHub real quick, if we hit refresh, it is now available for you to also clone from. So to clone it, you would just do git clone blank in the directory area that you'd want to put the project in at. So you can all work with the starting point. If you skipped ahead and just looked for this, congratulations. You didn't need to type all of this stuff out, but hopefully I think that a lot of people learn by doing. And so by following me step by step through these multitudes of hours, hopefully you've gained a richer understanding of how to set up your project. But now I think it's long awaited. Let's jump into the meat and potatoes of the tutorial and start building